Pisistratus was not a god, nor even a demigod, just a man with ambition as grand as Zeus's ego, and a wit as quick as Hermes on a good day. As the tyrant, red, benevolent dictator, or so he liked to think, of Athens, he had already seized power once, lost it, seized it again, long story, and been sent packing into exile by his resentful fellow Athenians. It's during one of those exiles that our story truly begins, far from the marble halls and olive groves of Athens, in a misty lakeside glen where geese gathered like gossiping old philosophers at the agora. Pisistratus trudged along the muddy banks of an unnamed lake in the wild north. Some say Thrace, others whisper it was the foothills of Mount Olympus itself. Wherever it was the kind of place a man goes to feel very sorry for himself, and indeed, Pisistratus was nursing his wounded pride. "Third time's the charm," he muttered, imagining his triumphant return to Athens someday. But at that moment, destiny, and perhaps the gods, who were assuredly watching with popcorn in hand, had something else in store. As dawn broke over the reeds, Pisistratus's ears caught an odd sound. Laughter. Not the raucous guffaw of drunken soldiers or the polite titter of courtiers at his canned jokes, but light, melodic laughter, unmistakably feminine. He crouched behind a clump of marsh grass and peered through. What he saw made him blink twice. In a clearing by the lake, a group of 5 young women were splashing and bathing in the cool waters, their discarded clothes, or what looked like clothes, piled neatly on the shore. But these weren't ordinary garments. They were feathery, downy cloaks, whitish gray and brown. In fact, they looked suspiciously like the plumage of geese. Now, Pisistratus was a cunning man, but even he was perplexed. Were these nymphs? Were those goose feather cloaks some sort of local fashion? As he watched, one of the girls, a tall beauty with a long, graceful neck, even by human standards, and a laugh that seemed to dance on the breeze, waited a little farther from the others, closing her eyes as she floated on her back. An idea, a slightly wicked, undeniably risky idea, sparked in Pisistratus's mind. In a flash, the exiled tyrant tiptoed around the water's edge toward the pile of feathery cloaks. With the deft hands of a man who had pilfered a treasury or two in his day, he snatched the largest, downiest goose-skin cloak from the pile. At that very moment, one of the other maidens let out a high-pitched honk, shriek of alarm. The women all turned to see a fully clothed mortal man sprinting away with one of their cloaks. Pisistratus ran as if Erinyes were on his heels, and if these women were who he suspected, that wasn't far off. Behind him he could hear frantic calls, "Stop! Thief!" but also an unmistakable flapping of wings. He risked a glance back and nearly tripped in astonishment. 4 of the bathers were gone. In their place, 4 huge geese were beating their wings, taking flight from the water's surface. The 5th maiden, the tall one with the musical laugh, was still very much human, and very much wading awkwardly to shore, trying to cover herself with rushes and leaves once she realized her cloak was gone. Pisistratus slowed to a stop. He was no brute. He hadn't actually planned what to do beyond this point. Standing there, clutching the feathered cloak, he suddenly felt rather silly. The young woman approached him cautiously. Lacking her feathery covering, she shivered. Whether from cold or fury, it was hard to tell. "Give that back," she demanded, eyes flashing. No timid goose, this one. She had the commanding presence of a queen, even while dressed in pond weeds. Pisistratus gulped. He was used to being the one giving orders, not taking them. Still, he was also a notorious charmer when he wished to be. With a disarming smile, he said, "Forgive me, fair lady. I mean you no harm. I was just..." Here he invented madly. "Ensuring such a precious item didn't get stolen by someone else?" He winced at his own unconvincing words. She raised an eyebrow. "By stealing it yourself?" Temporary protective custody, he corrected brightly, as if this were a perfectly normal thing. I couldn't possibly let a ruffian make off with something so soft. The maiden rolled her eyes, an expression that needed no translation. That cloak is mine, sir, and I very much need it back. Pisistratus hesitated. If he gave it back outright, she'd transform and fly off like her sisters, and he'd lose the chance to learn more, not to mention possibly lose her, which his mind, ever quick on the uptake in matters of power and the heart, was rapidly deciding it did not want to do. On the other hand, if he kept it, that was essentially kidnapping. The moral dilemma lasted only a second. He was a tyrant after all. Moral dilemmas weren't really his forte. Perhaps we can come to an arrangement, he said carefully. You see, I find myself quite alone in these parts, and you appear to be in need of clothing. Why don't we help each other? She crossed her arms, unimpressed that this strange thief was now bargaining. Yet, with a deep breath, she replied, What do you propose? Thus it was that Pisistratus, former tyrant of Athens, made a deal with a goose maiden by a lake. He returned to her a portion of the cloak, enough that she could drape it around herself like a shawl, but not enough to take wing. In exchange, she agreed to accompany him at least to the next village where proper clothes and a hot meal could be had, and then they discussed the return of the rest of her feathered robe. It wasn't exactly Olympian in its nobility, but as far as Pisistratus was concerned, it was a win-win. Over the next few days of travel, he learned her name was Nessa, and she was indeed a swan maiden, or rather, a goose maiden, which, she was quick to note, is not any less dignified than a swan maiden, thank you very much. She and her sisters came from a far-off northern land where the summers were gentle and the winters harsh, and where, for half the year, they took on the form of geese to migrate south to warmer climes. Pisistratus was enthralled. As a politician, he'd heard plenty of fanciful tales, usually from his own propaganda department, but a genuine magical being sharing campfire stew with him was something new. Nessa, for her part, was wary of the mortal who had effectively coerced her company, but she found him oddly charming. He was gallant in small ways, offering his cloak when nights grew cold, cracking jokes to make her laugh. He discovered she snorted like a goose when something really tickled her, a fact she found mortifying and he found utterly endearing. Under the light of the moon, by their crackling fire, they talked. She spoke of the freedom of flight, the thrill of riding the winds over the Aegean, and the secret wonders of the land of the birds from whence she came. He spoke of Athens, of its bustling streets and wise philosophers, its art and temples, and how he loved it fiercely, flaws and all. There was a passion in his voice that matched the shine in his eyes when he described his city. Nessa listened, intrigued by this human who could love an idea, a whole city, almost as much as he was beginning to love her. And he was, though he would have rather been trampled by a herd of centaurs than admit it so soon. In classic Greek fashion, it wasn't long before Eros, that sneaky fellow, worked his magic. By the time they reached a respectable town with an inn, Pisistratus had entirely forgotten that this alliance had begun as a tactical maneuver. He was genuinely smitten, and Nessa, though she tried to deny it, had warmed to the earnest, if sometimes pompous man who treated her not just with desire, but with a curious reverence, as if she were a living symbol of freedom he desperately craved. They traveled on together for weeks, heading southward toward Athens. One crisp evening, as they watched the sun sink into the Aegean from a cliffside, Pisistratus gently took Nessa's hand. "Come with me to Athens," he implored softly. "Be my wife, my people. Well, they might take some convincing, but when they see you, they'll understand." "Understand what?" Nessa asked, turning to look at him full in the face. He smiled. "That miracles are real, that the gods have blessed me and Athens with someone extraordinary. It was a line worthy of a seasoned orator. More importantly, he meant it. Nessa's eyes brimmed with tears, the happy kind. For a moment, she couldn't speak, so she simply nodded. In that quiet sunset moment, the exiled tyrant and the goose maiden embraced, forging a partnership that no one in Athens would have ever predicted. Now, one might think this is the happily ever after bit, but remember, this is Greek myth. The real challenges often start after the vows. Pisistratus eventually rallied his forces, and a good bit of popular support, turns out promising to reduce taxes and recalling your charming backstory of humble exile life can win over hearts, and marched on Athens. By his side rode Nessa, cloaked in a fine woolen himation, dyed Athenian purple, her goose cloak safely tucked away in a chest at her own insistence until she could trust her new husband fully. A wise precaution. When they entered Athens in triumph, the city collectively did a double take. Athenians had seen a lot of odd things. This was a city where a man once convinced everyone a giant goddess, Athena, had escorted him on a chariot. But the sight of Pisistratus' mysterious bride caused quite the stir. She was radiant, to be sure, but there was something uncanny about her. Perhaps it was the way her head would tilt at the sound of distant honking, or how she was strangely adept at dodging errant olives tossed in the marketplace, as if she had a sixth sense for incoming projectiles. The gossip mill churned. She's a foreign princess, some speculated. No, she's a sorceress, others whispered. One fishmonger's wife swore she saw the lady snatch up a wriggling eel and swallow it whole at a banquet, but that was dismissed as nonsense. Mostly. At the splendid welcome feast in the Acropolis, Nessa tried her best to mind her manners and emulate the polished grace of Athenian noblewomen. But it was all too easy to slip up. Presented with a spread of greens and grains, she gleefully pecked at them, with her hands thankfully not literally pecking, but the rapidity and gusto raised a few eyebrows. When a court musician played a soothing melody, she couldn't help but hum along in an oddly throaty manner reminiscent of, well, a goose's honk. Pisistratus chuckled quietly into his wine. He found her quirks charming. The assembled dignitaries were baffled. One noblewoman, the severe and fashionable Lady Euphilia, watched with thinly veiled scorn. "Barbarian girl," Euphilia sniffed to her companions. "Look at her, probably doesn't even know which fork to use for the feta. Oh wait, she's using her fingers." A chorus of snickers. Nessa heard some of it and flushed with embarrassment. Pisistratus heard it too, and for a moment the old tyrant's temper flared. But before he could lash out, Nessa laid a calming hand on his arm. She shook her head slightly. She had faced worse in the wild than a few catty remarks. Yet, as the days turned to weeks, the strain on Nessa began to show. The Athenians were polite to her face. Pisistratus was, after all, in charge again, and not someone to cross lightly. But she was an outsider in every way. She tried to host a gathering of women at the palace, but her small talk about the best type of reed marsh to nest in was met with blank stares. When she attended a temple ceremony, the priest complained that a flock of geese inexplicably followed her there, disrupting the ritual. Even the children of Athens, though delighted by her ability to mimic bird calls, began to tease her by tossing breadcrumbs when she walked by. It was all done in good humor, of course, but each jibe was a tiny cut, and 1,000 tiny cuts can wound as much as a sword. Pisistratus was oblivious at first. He was busy reforming laws, doling out public funds, and generally basking in the glow of being back in power. He loved Nessa, surely, but he assumed she was adjusting well enough. It wasn't until one late autumn night, as they prepared for bed in their chamber, that everything came crashing down. Nessa had been unusually quiet all evening. Pisistratus finally asked, "Is something wrong, my love?" She turned to him with tears in her eyes, not the happy kind this time. "I don't belong here," she whispered. He was taken aback. "What? Of course you do. You're my wife. The people will come to adore you." "They call me goosewife behind my back," she said, voice trembling. "I hear them, mocking me. I tried, Stratus, I truly tried to be one of your people, but I feel caged. I miss the open sky. I miss me, the me that I am when I can stretch my wings." Pisistratus felt a chill of panic. She was talking nonsense, right? This was just cold feet. Cold, webbed feet, a cruel voice in his head quipped. "Nessa, darling, it's only been a few months. These things take time. Athens will come around, I promise. They just need more time to see how wonderful you are." She gave a sad smile, touching his cheek. "How wonderful I am as a human, you mean?" He grasped her hand. "Human. Goose. What does it matter? You are wonderful, period. And you are mine," he added with an intensity that surprised even him. Her expression changed, a flicker of anger. "Am I? Yours?" She pulled her hand away. "I was never a piece of property, Pisistratus. I came because I loved you. I stayed because I hoped I could share your life. But I cannot be what you or Athens expects. I can only be me." Pisistratus opened his mouth to protest further, but she held up a hand. "There is something I must tell you." From a trunk at the foot of their bed, she withdrew the goose feather cloak, the one he had half returned but largely kept out of sight at her request. His heart pounded. "I've watched you hide this away, as if even the sight of it might remind others of what I truly am," Nessa said softly. "But I will not hide any longer." He felt sweat on his brow. Was she going to leave? No, he couldn't allow it. "Nessa, please, we can work this out. If anyone has been cruel, I'll have them." He was about to say punished, tyrant habits die hard. "Dealt with." She shook her head. "You can't rule hearts with an iron fist, Pisistratus. Not even Zeus can do that, and believe me, he's tried." A tiny smile there, despite her tears. She stepped back and threw the feathered cloak over her shoulders. In an instant, where a moment ago stood a heartbroken woman, there now preened a majestic gray-brown goose. Pisistratus gasped despite himself, even though he knew of her transformation. It was one thing to accept it in theory. It was another to see his beloved wife suddenly with a beak and wings. The goose looked up at him. He would have sworn her eyes were also brimming with tears, though it's hard to tell with geese. In a flash of memory, Pisistratus recalled the day by the lake, his own laughter at how absurd and wonderful fate could be, how he'd thought capturing her cloak was a bright idea, how he loved her, truly, and how he was about to lose her. Nessa honked softly, a gentle, mournful sound, and flapped her wings. Realizing she needed an exit, Pisistratus hurried to throw open the balcony doors. The cool night air burst into the chamber, carrying with it the distant noise of the city and the glitter of stars overhead. For a brief moment, the goose lingered, standing in the doorway, looking back at the man who had been her husband. He could only stare, silent tears now on his cheeks. Then, with a mighty beat of her wings, she took to the air. Pisistratus rushed to the balcony rail. By moonlight, he watched a silhouette rise and circle the palace once, twice. He wondered if she was saying goodbye in her way. He whispered, "I love you," into the night, but the words were lost in the wind. The goose, Nessa, soared higher, then turned and flew north, beyond the Acropolis, beyond the hills. Within minutes, she was gone from sight. The next morning, Athens buzzed with rumor. The goosewife had vanished. Some said she was a witch who flew off on a broom, close but not quite. Others that Hera, offended by a mortal encroaching on her sacred geese, had smote her. Pisistratus issued a statement that his wife had gone to visit distant relatives, technically true if one counted the other geese wintering up north. He threw himself into his work and for a time ruled Athens with a curious mix of firmness and melancholy. He never remarried. Those in the know, a very small circle, whispered that on some nights the tyrant would climb the hill of the Knicks alone and gaze at the sky. He seemed to be listening for something, and indeed, occasionally at the height of migration season, a faint honk could be heard from the clouds above. Some swore Pisistratus' stern face would break into the slightest smile at that sound. Thus ends the tale of the goosewife of Pisistratus, a myth or perhaps a half-true legend from the blurred lines between history and magic. Athens remembers Pisistratus as a canny ruler who paved the way for its golden age, but few remember the woman, or goose, who may have briefly graced its skies and court. Their love was real, but their worlds were different. And as any Greek chorus worth its salt will tell you, the gods rarely permit a happy ending without a touch of tragedy. Chapter 2. The Trial of the He-Goat. The scene, Athens, circa 5th century BCE, on a bright morning in the Agora, where normally philosophers might be debating the nature of virtue or fishmongers haggling over the day's catch. But today, a most peculiar court case had captured the city's attention. The crowds gathered in a semicircle, whispering excitedly. In the center stood the accused, a rather bewildered-looking he-goat named Asterion, meaning starry, perhaps for the white speckles on his black coat. Unaware of the gravity of his situation, Asterion tugged lazily at the rope around his neck and attempted to munch on a tuft of grass between the paving stones. At the other end of the rope, his owner, Myron, shifted from foot to foot, anxiously. Myron was a farmer from the outskirts of Athens, broad-shouldered and sunburnt. He never imagined his best billy goat would one day stand trial for murder. Yet here they were. Presiding over this extraordinary hearing were the magistrates of the Prytaneon, an ancient court typically reserved for cases of sacrilege, or, notably, for trying inanimate objects and animals that caused a person's death. They sat on wooden benches with solemn faces, as if about to pass judgment on a treasonous general rather than a goat. At their center was Euphorion, a dignified elderly magistrate with a beard so long and white it could double as a philosopher's toga. He cleared his throat, signaling the trial to commence. "Bring forth the charges," Euphorion intoned. A man in a dark himation stepped forward, the prosecutor, one Lysimachos, who had the sharp features of a hawk and the self-righteous air of someone who had waited his whole life to prosecute a farm animal. In his arms he carried a small bundle, a pair of sandals, tattered and stained with something dark. A hush fell as he began. "Honored magistrates, people of Athens," Lysimachos cried, "we are gathered to seek justice for a most heinous act. This goat," he pointed dramatically at Asterion, who glanced up mid-chew, "did on the last full moon attack and cause the death of an Athenian citizen, Glaucus, son of Euphrates." A murmur swept through the crowd. Many knew Glaucus, a gentle old gardener who sold herbs in the market. To imagine him killed by a goat was both tragic and oddly surreal. Lysimachos continued, warming to his performance. The victim was found in Myron's olive grove, bruised and lifeless. Witnesses attest that they saw this very goat butting poor Glaucus multiple times, even after he fell. He held up the sandals. These were Glaucus's. Note the blood, evidence of the ferocity of the attack. At this, a woman in the crowd dabbed her eyes, and a man shook his head in disgust at the goat. Asterion bleated softly, oblivious. The prosecutor paced. "In our city of laws and reason, murder must be answered. If a man had committed this deed, we'd surely demand his life or exile at the very least. Shall we be more lenient because the killer has 4 legs and a penchant for eating tin cans? He let the rhetorical question hang. Onlookers nodded along. Ancient Greeks believed an unpunished murder could bring a curse of miasma, spiritual pollution, upon the city. Even if the perpetrator was an animal or object, the act needed ritual expiation. In their minds, this was deadly serious. To be fair, even today this scenario would raise eyebrows, and likely inspire a few comedic plays. Euphorion the magistrate turned now to Myron. Does the owner wish to speak for the defense? All eyes shifted to the burly farmer. Myron cleared his throat. Public speaking was not exactly his forte. He was more comfortable shouting at stray goats on a hillside than addressing a legal assembly. My lords, Myron began, tugging his forelock respectfully, Glaucus was my friend. I am horrified at what happened, but Astrion here is a good goat. He's never hurt anyone before. He gives the sweetest milk. Lysimachos, the prosecutor, interrupted with a derisive snort. We're not here to review the quality of the defendant's dairy output. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Myron's face reddened. What I mean is, he must have been provoked. Perhaps Glaucus had a bushel of wild thyme that Asterion wanted. This goat loves thyme. Or maybe a snake startled him and he leapt, accidentally striking Glaucus? He looked around, pleading for understanding. He's just an animal. He didn't know what he was doing. At this, the goat bleated loudly, as if to emphasize the point, eliciting a wave of laughter that cut through the tension. One of the magistrates, a younger man with an analytical look, leaned forward. Your goat has horns, does he not, farmer? Myron nodded slowly, patting Asterion's 2 curved horns. They were not large, but certainly capable of a solid knock. The magistrate continued, and are goats not known to butt objects or people that irritate them? We must determine if this was an unfortunate accident or a willful attack by the animal. The fact he spoke of willful animal attack with a straight face shows just how earnest the proceedings were. Lysimachos seized the moment to theatrical effect. There is precedent, honorable judges, for punishing creatures that spill human blood. Draco, the lawgiver's statutes, did not exempt beasts. We cannot let this goat go free as if nothing happened, or else tomorrow we may find lions claiming self-defense or bulls butting citizens in broad daylight. From the crowd, a voice shouted, couldn't we just sacrifice the goat to the gods and call it even? A ripple of agreement and a few shrugs from pragmatic types who figured, hey, free goat meat in the bargain. Euphorion rapped his staff on the ground. Order. That is not for the public to decide. The court will weigh the divine and civic aspects. At that moment, a slight figure pushed through the crowd. Phaedra, Glaucus' daughter, clutching a small clay figurine of Hestia, goddess of the hearth. Tears streaked her face. My father is dead, she said softly, voice trembling but audible. The people hushed. He was all I had. If we do nothing, his spirit will wander, restless. The gods demand justice, even if it's from a beast. She cast a baleful glance at Asterion, who had now lain down and was chewing cud, apparently bored by all this fuss. Phaedra's grief and sincerity moved many. Some in the crowd shouted, "Justice for Glaucus!" Myron looked at the distraught young woman and the unsympathetic faces around. He knelt and wrapped his arms around Asterion's neck protectively. Please, he implored, exile him if you must, but don't kill him. He's like family to me. The goat nuzzled Myron's shoulder, perhaps smelling a carrot hidden in the farmer's tunic. Myron often carried treats. The head magistrate, Euphorion, whispered with his colleagues. They were likely weighing a question that was part legal, part theological, and part, how on earth do we sentence a goat? After a few moments, Euphorion spoke, voice echoing. We have heard the testimonies. It is clear an unfortunate death occurred. We must honor the law and the gods. He paused, then delivered the verdict. This court finds the goat, Asterion, responsible for the death of Glaukos. As punishment, the goat shall be banished from the lands of Athens to appease the spirit of the deceased and cleanse the city of Miasma. Furthermore, a purification rite will be performed at the site of the incident and a sacrifice made to Zeus Agoraios, protector of the Agra, in Glaukos' memory. Myron bowed his head, relief and sorrow mixed. Exile meant Asterion would live, but must be taken far away. He'd essentially lose his prized companion. Phaedra, though still tearful, nodded. Perhaps this was enough closure for her heart and for the gods. The crowd had mixed reactions. Some expected a dramatic execution. Perhaps Zeus's lightning striking the goat on the spot, a bit much to ask. Others were simply fascinated such a trial took place at all and would regale less lucky friends with the tale for days in the taverns. The gathering dispersed slowly. A few sympathizers clapped Myron on the shoulder, muttering that it was the best outcome he could have hoped for. Lysimachos grumbled that banishment was too lenient. Rumor had it he'd hoped to host a goat roast that night in celebration of justice served. One must question his motives. As the sun climbed higher, Myron led Asterion out of the agora, the goat's bell jangling with each step. The poor creature seemed blissfully unaware that he was now in exile, likely imagining they were simply going on an adventure. In a way, he was right. Myron decided then and there he'd rather leave Attica entirely than abandon Asterion. There were other cities, other farms. Perhaps they'd try their luck in Boeotia, where folks were said to be less persnickety about legal niceties, and some joked less discerning in personal hygiene, but Myron could hardly be picky now. As they departed, a philosopher named Demetrios turned to his students who had witnessed the trial. "Let this be a lesson," he quipped dryly. "Even beasts are subject to the rule of law in Athens, or at least to the appearance of law." One student asked, "Master, do you think the goat understood any of that?" Demetrios chuckled. "The goat? Certainly not, but the people needed to make sense of a senseless death, and so we create meaning, even if it means dragging a goat to court." With that parting wisdom, life in Athens returned to its usual rhythm. The agora resumed its bustling chatter. The philosophers resumed philosophizing, and somewhere in the distance, perhaps at the very edge of Athenian territory, a farmer and his goat trudged down a dusty road into exile. Myron would later say that, as they crossed the border, Asterion let out one last mighty bleat back towards Athens, a farewell or an insult. Who could say? Goats, after all, keep their own counsel. Thus ended the trial of the he-goat, a chapter of Athenian lore that was equal parts tragic and absurd. It was remembered in hushed tones during the legal debates, remember the goat case, and with laughter in the alehouses, they really put a goat on trial. And perhaps, just perhaps, the gods of Olympus looked down at mortals taking even a goat's misdeeds so seriously and had a little chuckle themselves. Chapter 3, The Island of Snake People. Our tale now carries us across the wine-dark sea to a remote corner of the Aegean seldom visited by mortals. It was a small island, lush with green forests and ringed by silent beaches. Mariners usually gave it a wide berth, warning of treacherous rocks and uncanny whispers on the wind. They called it Ophiusa, the Snake Isle. And for good reason. Those few who had shipwrecked there and lived to tell the tale spoke of people with the lower bodies of great serpents, an island of snake people. Enter Leander, a young sailor from Rhodes with a heart full of wanderlust and a head perhaps not entirely full of sense. Leander found himself on a trading voyage that went horribly awry when a freak storm smashed his vessel on the reefs off an uncharted island's coast. He awoke on the beach amid splintered timbers, salt in his hair, and a single thought in his mind. Thank the gods, I'm alive. His crewmates were nowhere to be seen, likely rescued by passing ships or, tragically, lost. Alone but undaunted, Leander scavenged what he could: a knife, a waterlogged sack of grain, and a half-broken shield that might serve as a bowl, and set off inland to seek help, or at least fresh water. The island seemed oddly tranquil as he ventured under the canopy of ancient oaks and laurel. Too tranquil. No birdsong, he realized, only the sound of rustling leaves. Or was that something slithering through the undergrowth? Leander gripped his knife tighter. He had heard sailors' yarns of islands full of strange creatures, usually exaggerated to pass time at the oars. He hoped this was just another tall tale. Presently, he came upon a clearing where a crystal-clear spring bubbled forth into a pool. Thirsty and grateful, Leander dropped his gear and knelt to drink. As he cupped the cool water to his lips, a voice hissed sharply, "Step away from the spring!" Leander jumped to his feet, water splashing. Across the pool he saw them, two figures emerging from the foliage. From the waist up they appeared human. A man and a woman, both clad in simple, woven tunics. But below, each of them sported the coiled, muscular tail of a serpent, covered in scales that glinted emerald and bronze in the dappled sunlight. The woman had long dark hair and piercing amber eyes with slit pupils. The man wore a beard and held a spear tipped with obsidian. Leander's mouth went dry, and it wasn't from dehydration. His mind raced. He had indeed found the island of snake people, and now it seemed he was caught trespassing. He raised his hand slowly, trying to show he meant no harm. "Forgive me," he stammered. I was shipwrecked. I didn't know anyone lived here." The snake man and snake woman exchanged glances. Others now emerged from the trees surrounding the clearing. A dozen or so, men and women, all with those serpentine lower halves. It was both terrifying and strangely wondrous to behold them coiling and uncoiling with agility and grace. Leander noted that some had markings on their scales like those of vipers, others smoother like pythons. Children peeked from behind the adults. Even they sported little tails flicking curiously. The man with the spear spoke first. "He is an outsider. He may be a threat." He slowly drew back his weapon, ready to throw. Leander quickly blurted, "I come in peace. I swear by Zeus, Poseidon, and all the gods, I intend no harm." At the mention of the gods, a few of the snake people murmured or frowned as if pained. The woman with amber eyes slid forward. "You're from Greece?" Leander nodded. "Rhodes, originally. I was sailing home when the storm hit." She eyed him up and down, her forked tongue flickering out momentarily as if tasting the air, or his scent. It was unnerving, but Leander held his ground. "He carries a labrys," she noted, pointing at an axe hanging from his belt. Leander realized she meant the small, double-headed axe. Labrys he had tucked in his sash, a tool from the ship. He quickly unfastened it and set it on the ground. "Just a tool, see? I lay it down." The tension eased a fraction. The spear-holding man lowered his arm a bit. The woman turned to the others. "We should take him to Melanthia." At that name, the circle of snake folk seemed to agree and parted to make a path. "Melanthia will decide his fate," the man said sternly to Leander. With that, two others slithered behind Leander, gently but firmly guiding him away from the spring and along a mossy trail. Leander figured that resisting was not an option, and truthfully, curiosity was getting the better of him now. They didn't kill him on sight, which he took as a positive sign. The forest opened up to a village of sorts, huts made of wood and clay, woven thatch roofs, much like those in any human village, except many were built partially into the hillsides or trees with wide entrances to accommodate slithering instead of walking. Gardens of vegetables and fruit trees lined the area, and he even saw livestock, goats and chickens, tended by a snake-tailed youth. The irony of snake people raising chickens was not lost on Leander, who almost chuckled at the sight. The animals seemed strangely at ease around their serpentine masters. At the center of the village stood a larger structure, a sort of hall with carved pillars depicting, unsurprisingly, entwined snakes. Waiting outside was an older woman with a regal bearing. Her hair was silver, braided with gold thread, and a band of bronze circled her brow. From the waist down, her scales were faded in color, like tarnished copper, but her presence was undeniably authoritative. This, Leander surmised, was Melanthia. The escorting pair announced, "We found him at the sacred spring, revered one, a castaway from the outside world." Melanthia studied Leander, her expression unreadable. "What is your name, young man?" she asked, voice soft but with an undertone of power. "Leander, my lady," he replied politely. She narrowed her eyes at my lady, but didn't comment on it. "You are the first outsider to set foot on our shores in many years. Do you know where you are?" Leander swallowed. "I've heard stories. They call this place Ophiusa, the island of snakes, and I see now the stories spoke true, though they never told how." He trailed off, unsure if stating the obvious, that she was half snake, might offend. Melanthia's gaze turned distant. "They never told how such a curse came to be, did they?" Her tone was bitter, but controlled. Curse. Leander's ears perked at that. Before he could respond, she beckoned him into the hall. "Come, you will hear our tale, and then, Leander of Rhodes, we shall see what the gods intend for you and for us." Inside the hall, it was cool and dim. Oil lamps cast flickering light on the walls, where faded murals depicted scenes of humans and gods. Leander glimpsed one showing a beautiful woman kneeling before a radiant goddess. Another showed figures transforming, their legs melding into serpent tails. This was indeed the story of these people. Melanthia coiled onto a cushioned platform, like a dignitary's bench, and gestured for Leander to sit on a carved stool. The other snake folk gathered quietly at the periphery as if this were an oft-told but important ritual. "In ancient times," Melanthia began, "this island was a prosperous small kingdom known not as Ophiusa, but as Telemos. Our people were seafarers and farmers, and I was its queen." Leander blinked. She must be far older than she looked. She noticed his surprise and smiled without mirth. "Yes, our lifespans grew longer with the curse. A small consolation. But let me continue. The gods were generous to Telemos until the day my hubris, or perhaps my innocence, changed everything. You see, I was favored by Zeus." At this, there were hisses among the listeners. Whether in disdain or reverence, Leander couldn't tell. "The king of the gods took a fancy to me, visiting in disguise, as is his wont. When I discovered his true identity, I rejected his advances." Melanthia's jaw tightened. "I was young and happily wed to my husband, the king. Zeus does not enjoy being refused, but it was his wife Hera whose wrath we truly earned." At the mention of Hera, Leander felt a chill. He knew the tales of her jealousy. "Hera, in her rage at Zeus's interest in me, even though nothing happened, sent a terrible curse. She transformed my people. By day we were as we are now, half human, half serpent. By night, fully serpents, losing even the voices to speak. She wanted us to be so repulsive and alien that her husband, or any god, would never look at us again." A collective sigh came from the crowd. Some hung their heads. One young girl wiped away tears with the end of her tail. Melanthia continued, voice steady but heavy with centuries of sorrow. "Our king, my beloved, was turned entirely to stone on the spot where Hera cast her spell. Perhaps she thought it kinder than making him a beast, or perhaps it was punishment to me to lose him. Telemos became Ophiusa, a place of exile from the world of men. Occasionally a shipwreck or adventurer would stumble here, and we dared to hope for help. But most fled in fear at the sight of us. Her golden eyes locked onto Leander's, or they tried to kill us. We defended ourselves when we had to. Over time, the world forgot us, and we have lived in lonely peace ever since. A silence fell. Leander realized he'd been holding his breath. That is a cruel fate indeed, he managed softly. Being a Greek, he had no trouble believing Hera capable of such a deed. Have you sought no cure? Has no god shown mercy? At this, some of the snake folk hissed, definitely in bitterness. Melanthia sighed. We have prayed to all, to Zeus for forgiveness, though he should seek ours, to Hera for mercy, a fool's errand, to Apollo, Athena, Demeter, any who would listen. Either they cannot undo a curse of a fellow Olympian, or will not. Only one gave us a glimmer of hope, Apollo. Through his oracle at Delphi, a prophecy came to us long ago. She beckoned an attendant who brought forth a clay tablet. On it, an ancient Delphic verse was etched. Melanthia recited from memory. When a voyager from Helios's land shall be stranded upon serpent sand, if heart of hero by queen's love doth bind, the curse shall its undoing find. Through trial of fang and trial of night, to break Hera's wrath by Olympian light. Leander listened intently. A voyager from Helios's land? Helios is the sun, might mean the east? Melanthia gave a small nod. One interpretation is a foreigner from the east or a sunlit isle. Rhodes, where you hail from, is sometimes called Helios's isle. For the sun, God is much revered there. Leander felt a spark. Could it be he was prophesied to come? It seemed almost too convenient. He noticed Melanthia watching him keenly. Heart of hero by queen's love doth bind, he repeated. What do you make of that? The old queen took a long breath. Perhaps that the hero, voyager, would earn the love of the queen of this land. I am the queen, and in a sense, my love, or blessing, for the hero, or... She hesitated, then continued. Perhaps it suggests the hero himself will feel love for the queen, or she for him. A rather poetic way to phrase things. Delphi is never straightforward. Leander blushed slightly. He was a young man, yes, but Melanthia, though striking, was a grandmotherly figure. The idea of a romance there seemed unlikely. Perhaps the queen's love could be symbolic, like her favor. In the trials of Fang and Night, he pressed, we think it means 2 ordeals must be overcome. Perhaps one during the day, Fang, maybe a snake bite, and one by night, when we are fully serpents. Leander milled it over. An excitement stirred in his chest. It sounds like I might be the one this prophecy awaited. I mean, here I am from Rhodian Helios's land, by pure chance, or not chance. He looked around at the hopeful, skeptical faces. Suddenly he stood and bowed formally to Melanthia. Your Majesty, if the gods, even cunning Apollo, have brought me here to aid you, then I will do all in my power. Tell me what I must do to lift this curse. The crowd broke into surprised whispers. Some looked hopeful for the first time. Others warned caution. We barely know this human, one snake man muttered. Melanthia's eyes glistened with emotion. After a moment, she slithered down and placed a hand on Leander's shoulder. You are brave, or perhaps just reckless. Either way, you give us something we have not had in a long time. Hope. That afternoon, a council was held with Leander, Melanthia, and the community's elders. They debated the meaning of the prophecy and how Leander could fulfill it. Ultimately, they settled on a plan. the most literal interpretation of the prophecy's latter half. At the center of the island loomed a craggy mountain. In a cavern halfway up its slope dwelt a monstrous snake, Python, a child of the original Python slain by Apollo at Delphi, or so they believed. This beast had menaced the island even before Hera's curse, and after, Hera seemingly left it as an additional guard to ensure the islanders never left. Any attempt to build a boat or signal for help was thwarted by the Python attacking. Facing this creature would certainly qualify as a trial of Fang. If Leander could defeat or survive Python, that might satisfy part 1. As for the trial of night, they interpreted it as Leander enduring a night among the snake people when they fully transformed. Possibly a test of trust and friendship. If he could make it to dawn alive, assuming someone didn't eat him in mindless serpent form, it could symbolize the breaking of barriers between human and snake kind. Perhaps what the prophecy intended by binding love friendship with the queen's people. It was risky. By night, Melanthia warned, even she lost her human mind to the snake instinct. Leander, though inwardly anxious, agreed to this dual trial. A hero's heart pounded in his chest, whether placed by Apollo's subtle hand or simply arising from his own adventurous spirit. Plus, he found himself truly sympathizing with these people and wanting to see them free. It didn't hurt that one of the younger snake women, a gentle soul named Calypsa, had been tending to his bruises from the shipwreck with herbal poultices, and his heart did a little extra thump when she was near. Perhaps Queen's love was misdirection, and it was her love he was binding with, but one thing at a time. As dusk approached, Leander prepared to set out for the mountain cave where Python laired. To his surprise, Melanthia declared she would accompany him for part of the way. "I may be old," she said, "but I know the creature's habits. I can guide you to its den unseen, though I fear I cannot fight by your side once the battle begins." Others offered weapons. They gave Leander a stout spear tipped with bronze and a wooden shield reinforced with snake-shed scales, curiously strong and light. Calypsa slithered up to Leander just before he left. By twilight she had legs still. The full snake transformation happened only in total darkness, so she walked up, albeit gingerly. She pressed a small amulet into his hand, a pendant carved from jade in the shape of a snake coiled around a sun. "For luck and protection," she said, her cheeks flushing a bit. "It's an emblem of Apollo. It was my father's." Leander clasped her hand in thanks, noticing her human hand was growing cooler and a bit rougher as scales began to form with the failing light. Night was coming soon. He realized with a start that he needed to face Python and return before complete nightfall if he didn't want to also face his allies turned snakes in feral form in the wilderness. The trial of night was meant to be in the village under somewhat controlled circumstances, not in the wild with a monstrous python and a cursed populace simultaneously. With urgency, he set off, Melanthia leading through the forest paths at an impressive pace for her age, her long tail propelling her swiftly. The sky turned a deep orange and then purple. As they neared the rocky slopes, Melanthia stopped. "I dare not go further. The python's presence, I can smell it." She looked at Leander gravely. "May Apollo guide your arm. If you defeat the beast, hurry back to us. We will try to remain near the spring at the village edge come dawn to meet you, but by nightfall we will all be—" She didn't finish. She handed him a small clay flask. "A healing tonic, just in case. And, Leander, thank you." With that, Melanthia retreated, her form already starting to shift. He glimpsed her face, elongating slightly before she vanished into the shadowy brush, sparing him the full sight. Leander steeled himself and climbed towards the yawning cave visible against the twilight sky. A foul, musky scent hit his nostrils. definitely snake. The entrance was ringed with bones of animals and, alarmingly, a few human skeletons, previous shipwrecked souls who tried their luck. He entered, torch in one hand, spear in the other. The cave was vast inside, descending into darkness. The sound of dripping water echoed. He took a few cautious steps when a massive shape uncoiled from a stalagmite. Two glowing yellow eyes opened, reflecting his torchlight. The python was enormous, thicker than a tree trunk, its length disappearing into the gloom. It hissed, a sound that rattled the very rocks. Trial of fang indeed, Leander thought wryly, heart hammering. Then the beast lunged. What followed was a blur of adrenaline and instinct. The python struck like lightning. Leander dove aside, its jaws snapping shut inches from him, fangs as long as daggers. He thrust his spear at its side, the bronze point scraping off thick scales, not a deep hit, but it enraged the monster. The serpent coiled, tail whipping around. It caught Leander's leg and yanked. He was thrown off his feet, hitting the cavern wall hard. Stars burst in his vision. The python's coils began wrapping around him, and he realized if he didn't act, he'd be crushed. With a yell, he drove the point of the spear into the coil that was looping over his chest. This time, the tip found a softer spot between scales. The python let out an ear-splitting hiss and recoiled slightly. Leander seized the moment to scramble out of its first coil, though his leg was still entwined. The beast reared up, part of its body still around Leander's ankle, and he dangled upside down as it lifted him, trying to shake him loose or perhaps slam him down. He remembered the shield. He dropped it when thrown. It lay nearby. As he swung helplessly, he also recalled the broken ship's shield he had earlier. Worthless now. No matter. He reached for his belt and found the small shipworker's axe, the labrys. In one swift motion, as the python began to whip him downward, Leander twisted and hacked the axe into the snake's tail that held him. It wasn't a clean cut, but it bit in enough that the python reflexively loosened in pain. Leander crashed to the ground, free at last, but bruised and dizzy. The monster was wounded now, oozing dark blood from tail and side, but far from defeated. It circled him, wary. Leander shakily got to his feet, gripping spear in one hand, axe in the other. He had to aim for the head, the only sure way. The python feinted and snapped. He dodged and tried a counter thrust, which glanced off the jaw. The thing was too strong and fast. In the chaotic dance, Leander's torch had fallen, its flame now guttering on the cave floor. Darkness encroached, and with it, Leander knew the snake people back in the village were turning fully into serpents. Time was running out on many fronts. He needed an edge. His hand brushed the pendant Calypso gave him. Apollo. Light. That was it. Python's progenitor was slain by Apollo with blazing arrows. These creatures hated Apollo's light and heat. Leander dove toward the fallen torch and thrust the head of his spear into it, igniting the spear's wooden shaft tip. It caught fire, creating a makeshift fire spear. The python hissed angrily at the sudden bright flame. It recoiled, coiling back. Leander didn't hesitate. Summoning the last reserves of his strength, he hurled the burning spear with all his might at those glowing eyes in the dark. By some fortune, or divine guidance, the spear struck true, the fire lending it accuracy. It pierced the python's right eye and sank deep into its skull. The cavern lit up with a burst of flame and thrashing as the python's body convulsed in agony. Leander, unsure if it was dead, grabbed his axe again and limped forward. The giant snake lay in a heap, only twitching now, the spear's fire singeing its head, and the life gone from its remaining eye. To be certain, Leander brought the axe down on the skull with a grim determination, then quickly stepped back as the body gave a final spasm. He had done it. Trial of fang overcome. But he had no time to celebrate. The fight had taken a lot out of him, and night was fully fallen outside the cave. The second trial awaited, and he wasn't even sure what form it would take. Catching his breath, he hastily tore a strip from his tunic to bandage a gash on his arm, the healing tonic he decided to save for more dire need, though he did gulp a bit for energy. He reclaimed the jade pendant from the ground, miraculously unbroken, and whispered a thanks to Apollo. Then he exited the cave, jogging, then running down the slope toward the village, guided by faint moonlight. The jungle noises of night were eerie. Howls, hoots, and hisses. He soon slowed, hearing rustling in the foliage to his left. Was it one of them? A snake person turned snake? He recalled Melanthia's warning. At night, they are fully serpents with no human reason. They might see him as prey or intruder. Leander took a cautious step. A shape slithered out onto the path. A snake as thick as a man's thigh and maybe 10 feet long. Its scales glinted bronze. It raised its head, tongue tasting the air, and Leander recognized something. The pattern on those scales was like Melanthia's. Could it be the queen herself, in full serpent form, drawn perhaps by the scent of the python's blood on him, or just wandering her domain? The snake regarded him, swaying slightly. He kept still, lowering his gaze to appear less threatening. He had learned that trick from snake charmers back in Rhodes. Melanthia? He said softly, hoping some part of her might recognize her own name. The snake's tongue flickered. Hard to tell. It advanced slowly. He stepped back, heart thumping. If this was Melanthia, he needed to prove friendship. If it wasn't, well, treat it like it was anyway. Either way, showing calm was probably best. He remembered he had some of that grain from the ship in his sack. Not that snakes eat grain, far from it, but maybe the scent could distract? That seemed silly. Instead, he gently took out the flask of tonic Melanthia gave. It had her scent, perhaps. He uncorked it and let a tiny bit drizzle on his hand, then held it out. The large snake paused and then, to his relief, recoiled slightly as if recognizing something and losing interest. It slithered away into the brush. Leander let out a breath. If only all would be so uneventful. But as he neared the village outskirts, the scene grew more precarious. Serpents of varying sizes were all about, some coiled on roofs, some looped around trees, others crossing the paths. It was like walking into a den of vipers, literally, except these were the villagers he'd spoken with hours before. He even saw a small green snake that might have been one of the children resting in a basket. He gingerly made his way to the central spring by the village edge, where they had planned to gather at dawn. But dawn was a few hours away still. He would have to last the night here among them, without harming any, which would rather undercut the whole love and trust thing, and without getting bitten by accident. He settled himself on a flat rock by the spring, winced at his bruises, and forced himself to remain alert. In the darkness, shapes writhed, and eyes occasionally gleamed. It took all his willpower not to flinch whenever a snake brushed past his foot. At one point, a large constrictor, perhaps the man with the spear from earlier, began to wind around the rock he sat on, looming over his shoulder. Leander remained very still, murmuring soothingly like one might to a skittish horse. The snake rested its head briefly on his uninjured shoulder. He felt its cool scales and felt oddly calm. Then it slid off and away, leaving him unmolested. The night air was filled with the sounds of hissing and the rustling of scales on grass. Leander's eyelids grew heavy, but he dared not sleep. Instead, he spoke softly into the night, unsure if any human consciousness could hear, but hoping somewhere, somehow, their souls took comfort. He recounted a funny story about his childhood in Rhodes, about sneaking into the temple of Apollo to leave an offering of a wooden toy boat he carved. He then softly sang a sailor's lullaby, a tune of home and safe harbors. A few smaller snakes actually coiled up as if to listen, or so he imagined. At long last, a pale glow crept into the sky. The serpents around him began to stir more vigorously. One by one, in the first light of dawn, a remarkable transformation took place. The snakes began to lengthen and rise, scales shimmering and reshaping. Human torsos emerged where serpentine heads had been. It was as if hundreds of years of curse reversed with every sunrise, only to return each sunset. Leander watched in awe as the community became humanoid once more. Many seemed disoriented, as if awaking from a dream. Then they noticed Leander. He stood up slowly, stiff and exhausted, but smiling. He had survived the night among them, unharmed, and more importantly, he had not harmed them. Melanthia, restored to her aged but stately half-human form, approached, tears in her eyes. "You stayed," she whispered. "You doubted?" He chuckled, though he was swaying on his feet. "I'm not much of a runner anyway." At that, a nervous, then growing laughter rippled through the gathered people. Some clapped. Calypsa, now human above the waist again, rushed forward impulsively and embraced Leander. Others followed, wrapping around him in a group hug of scaly tails and warm arms. Leander found himself laughing and grimacing from some bruises at the same time. As the first rays of direct sun peeked over the horizon, something even more astounding happened. The jade pendant on Leander's chest began to glow softly. A breeze picked up, swirling around the spring. The water in the pool gleamed with sudden golden light. Everyone fell silent. Melanthia gasped and pointed. A figure, translucent and radiant, stood on the other side of the spring. A young man with laurel wreath and a lyre. It was Apollo himself, or at least an apparition of the god. "Rejoice, people of Telemos," Apollo's voice rang out, clear and melodious. "For the trials have been met, the prophecy fulfilled." He looked upon Leander and gave a nod of approval and perhaps a wink. "Hera's curse shall now be lifted. You have shown unity, courage, and love. Let it never be said Apollo does not reward the faithful or the bold." The god raised a hand, and the sunlight intensified, bathing the entire clearing in warmth. Leander shielded his eyes. A collective gasp arose as the snake people felt a change. Where once scales glinted on their lower bodies, now legs began to form. Tails split and reshaped into thighs, knees, calves, feet. In moments, they were wholly human from head to toe. The villagers cried out in elation and disbelief. Some danced, albeit clumsily, as they adjusted to having legs. Several promptly fell into the spring amid laughter. Melanthia, now an elderly woman fully, sank to her knees, tears streaming, murmuring thanks to Apollo and all the gods. Calypsa looked at her feet, wiggling her new toes in wonder, then at Leander with pure joy. Apollo's apparition grew faint in the bright light, but they heard him once more. "Live henceforth in peace among your fellow men, and as for the hero who helped make this possible..." At this, Leander felt a gentle warmth infuse his battered body. Apollo was mending his wounds and restoring his strength, a parting gift. May you find your own reward in love and legacy. With a final chord on his lyre that echoed like the sweetest sunrise melody, Apollo vanished. The newly restored people of Telemos, for they would surely reclaim their old name now, cheered and wept all at once. They crowded around Melanthia and Leander. Someone brought a cloak to cover Melanthia's now human lower half, which she accepted with a laughing thank you, modesty suddenly relevant again after centuries. Children who had only ever known a slithering life stomped and jumped, playing an impromptu game of whose legs are wobblier. Leander found Calypsa by his side, holding his hand tightly. "We are in your debt, Leander of Rhodes," she said softly. "Nonsense. It seems we were all pieces in the god's puzzle," he replied, though he squeezed her hand back. "But I won't refuse a hot meal and a place to rest." He finally allowed himself to feel just how sore and tired he was. They celebrated with a grand feast that day, the first feast as humans in a long, long time. They fished and cooked, picked fruits, and poured wine that had aged for decades in casks. No human parties to drink it. Leander was treated like an honored guest, or rather, a savior and newfound friend. Melanthia formally offered him the title of Hero of Telemos, and even playfully suggested he could be king if he wished. She was quite ready to retire. Leander politely declined the crown, but accepted a more personal honor. He and Calypsa had, through the long ordeal, grown close, and with Melanthia's blessing and a knowing smile. Perhaps that Queen's love line did have a twist after all. Leander asked Calypsa to accompany him, whether back to his world or to let him stay in hers. In the end, Leander stayed on the island for many months, helping the Telemosians rebuild a life that could interact with the outside world again. When a passing merchant ship finally dared stop, drawn by the unusual smoke of cooking fires on an island thought uninhabited, they found not monsters but a thriving little community of people eager to trade fine fruits, medicinal herbs, and handcrafted goods. Centuries of quiet life had made them excellent artisans. Word spread of the miracle of Telemos, and while many Greeks shrugged it off as a tall tale, some understood that the age of heroes still had room for surprises. Leander eventually took Calypsa to Rhodes to meet his family, and they married in a ceremony attended by a few Telemosian delegates, Melanthia included, who enjoyed dancing on her 2 feet as much as anyone that night. But they made their home primarily in Telemos, bridging 2 worlds. The island, no longer cursed, became known not for snakes, but for its people's kindness, wisdom, and strangely, their affinity for healing, perhaps a lasting gift from Apollo. Visitors who heard whispers of a snake kingdom found only normal folk, though some observant ones noticed that the locals still had a playful tendency to bask in warm sunlight and could spot a mouse in the grass from remarkably far away, habits lightly lingering from old days. Thus concludes the saga of the island of snake people. Once a cautionary tale of curse and isolation, now a story of redemption, friendship, and the breaking of barriers. If you ever sail the Aegean and find a hospitable island with a little carved snake on its welcome sign, you might be in Telemos. And if you meet an elderly lady named Melanthia or a jovial couple named Leander and Calypsa, be sure to raise a cup of wine to them, for you now know the extraordinary journey that brought their people back into the light. Chapter 4. The Case of the Murderous Statue. The trouble began, as many troubles do in Greek tales, with a grudge. On the island of Thasos, there stood a magnificent bronze statue of the great athlete Theagenes. In life, Theagenes had been a celebrated boxer and pancratiast. Think MMA fighter with fewer rules and more olive oil. He'd won over 1,300 bouts in various games, a legend in his own time. When he died, the people of Thasos, proud of their hometown hero, erected a statue in his honor in the Agora. Now, enter Drakon, unfortunately named, given what follows, a man of Thasos who had once been soundly beaten by Theagenes in a boxing match. For years, Drakon nursed his black eye, both literal and prideful, and when Theagenes passed away peacefully in his sleep, the only opponent he couldn't outpunch being old age, Drakon found himself irrationally enraged that the man even got a statue. "A demigod, they call him," Drakon would grumble into his wine. "Humph. He was smug, I tell you. Never even apologized for breaking my nose." Rumor had it, Theagenes broke a lot of noses, few apologies given. One moonless night, Dracon stumbled out of a tavern well into his cups and decided to pay a visit to the Agora. There loomed Theagenes' statue, gleaming faintly in the starlight, every muscle of bronze, Theagenes still taunting him with frozen perfection. Dracon saw red. He staggered up to the statue and began to berate it. "Think you're better than me, eh? Even dead, you stand taller." To be fair, the statue was mounted on a nice plinth. In his drunken fury, Dracon did something no sane person would. He started punching the statue. Bronze met flesh with a resounding thunk. "Ow!" Dracon yelped, cradling his now broken hand. This only doubled his anger. He grabbed a loose stone and hurled it at Theagenes' metal face. The clang echoed through the empty marketplace. Perhaps it was the shift in weight, or maybe an earthquake tremor, or just the gods deciding they'd had enough of this foolishness. But the next moment was one for the books. The statue of Theagenes toppled forward. In a comic half-second, Dracon's rage turned to cartoonish wide-eyed panic as he realized 1,000 pounds of bronze hero were coming his way. He had just enough time to let out a squeak that sounded vaguely like, "Not a gay," before Theagenes delivered, one might say, the final blow. A very heavy, fatal blow. Come morning, the people of Thasos were greeted by a bizarre sight. The great Theagenes statue lying on the ground, and beneath it, very much dead and very much flattened, their townsman, Dracon. The talk of the Agora that day made the babble of Homer's heroes seem tame. By afternoon, an official inquiry was underway. The Thasian magistrates scratched their heads at this quandary. Murder was murder. Dracon's death had to be answered, but the murderer in this case appeared to be an inanimate object. A law going back to Draco of Athens, no relation to Dracon, despite the serpentine name, stipulated that if a person was killed by an object, that object must be put on trial and cast out of the community to lift any curse or miasma. It sounded absurd, but even absurd laws must be heeded when gods and furies are involved. And so, for the second time in Greek history, the first being, we suspect, a rather unfortunate roof tile that fell on somebody's head, a court convened to try a non-living culprit. They propped the statue of Theagenes back upright with considerable effort and a few hernias, and placed it before the tribunal. Word had spread, and a throng of curious onlookers gathered. After all, it's not every day you witness CSI, ancient Greece with a statue as the accused. The chief magistrate, a portly man named Nicomedes, cleared his throat trying to maintain composure. "Statue of Theagenes of Thasos," he proclaimed, not at all sure if he should be addressing it like a person. "You stand accused of the murder of Dracon, son of Philocles. The court shall examine the facts." At this, a helpful priest of Zeus, dragged in to advise on spiritual matters, intoned a prayer to Nemesis, the goddess of justice. A tad ironic, given Nemesis was more about revenge and Dracon kind of got what could be seen as divine payback. Witnesses were called. The baker who opened shop at dawn testified to finding Dracon quite pancaked under the bronze champion. A neighbor recalled Dracon's long-standing grudge against the deceased athlete. A tipsy friend from the previous night sheepishly recounted Dracon's ill-conceived sparring match with the statue. He was yelling and punching it, and I think he threw a rock. Next thing I know, boom, statue and Dracon are both on the ground. I sobered up real quick, the friend said to muffled laughter. The magistrates conferred. On one hand, it seemed obvious. Dracon brought this fate on himself. On the other, the law was clear about expunging the pollution of bloodshed. Superstitions ran deep. You didn't want a cursed statue haunting the town. So they reached the only conclusion that wouldn't anger the gods or set a weird precedent of statue self-defense, guilty, with a sentence of exile for the statue. Thus, in a ceremony equal parts solemn and ridiculous, the people of Thasos hauled the statue to the cliffs overlooking the sea. Dracon's family, though embarrassed at his foolish death, attended to see justice done for form's sake. The bronze Theagians gazed impassively, as always, at the horizon. Perhaps a few imagined a glint of regret in those metal eyes, but that was likely just the sun. With a final push, the statue was cast into the sea, banished from Thasian soil. The crowd dispersed, some crossing themselves, the ancient equivalent, perhaps making a gesture to ward off evil, others gossiping that maybe the old legends of objects coming to life weren't so far-fetched after all. Life moved on. Dracon got a modest burial. No one erected a statue for him, understandably. Theagenes' statue presumably sank to the seabed, where fish might now swim curiously through the crook of his bronze arm. The matter, it seemed, was settled. But the story doesn't end there. Some months later, Thasos was struck by a string of bad luck. The grape harvest failed, goats stopped producing milk, and a mysterious illness swept through the town. The superstitious murmured about miasma. Maybe chucking the statue into the sea hadn't fully cleansed the curse? Or worse, maybe the gods were angry that a hero's likeness had been treated so. After all, Theagenes had been nearly deified by some. People used to leave small offerings at the foot of his statue for good luck in athletics. Perhaps by punishing the statue, they had offended the hero's spirit. Desperate, the Thasian leaders sent envoys to the oracle at Delphi. The Pythia, in one of her trancy pronouncements, answered, "Return your champion to his home, only he can lift the cloud over your isle." That was enough for them. A fishing vessel was dispatched to the approximate splashdown point of the statue. With nets and grappling hooks, and perhaps the guidance of Poseidon, who might have been a fan of Theagenes' wrestling style, they managed to haul the statue up from the depths. Back in the agora, they reinstalled poor Theagenes on his pedestal. This time, they performed rites to appease his spirit, offerings of oil, flowers, and a sacrificial goat, kept far away from the statue, just in case it decided to tip over on livestock next. The town elders made a public proclamation. "Henceforth, let Theagenes be honored as a hero. We apologize, ere humbly beg forgiveness for the previous misunderstanding." If a statue could look forgiving, Theagenes' still looked mostly just like a statue, but the gesture seemed to work. The next day, the goat's milk flowed rich and sweet, the vineyards started showing new green, and the mysterious illness abated. Coincidence? In ancient Greece? Surely not. From that time on, Theagenes' statue became a site of pilgrimage for athletes seeking inspiration, and for locals who swore that on certain nights, the statue's bronze eyes glowed faintly under the moonlight, as if the old champ was keeping watch. Dracon's misadventure passed into legend, often told with a moral about letting go of grudges, and about not picking fights with things made of bronze. And so, the case of the murderous statue closed with an almost fairy tale ending. The murderer was exonerated, posthumously or post-bronze ously. The community was healed, and everyone learned a little lesson about anger management and legal absurdity. Well, perhaps not everyone. A neighboring polis briefly toyed with the idea of suing a poisoned loaf of bread for killing a man, but that, as they say, is another story. Chapter 5. The Guy Who Tried to Live on Air Alone. Athens has never had a shortage of eccentrics. This is, after all, the city where philosophers in robes argue about the meaning of existence, while unwashed cynics heckle them from wine barrels. But even by Athenian standards, Meton was an oddball. He woke up one fine morning and announced to anyone who would listen, which initially was just a bemused chicken pecking in the courtyard, that he had solved one of life's great riddles. "Food," he declared, "is a trap." This startling revelation came to him, he claimed, in a dream where Zeus himself boomed from the heavens. Mortals toil day and night for bread. What a waste! The air is all you need if you only believe. Now, whether Zeus actually moonlit as a dietary consultant is questionable, but Meton was utterly convinced. He would become Eryphagos, air-eater, sustaining himself purely on the divine ether, proving that a man might live free of earthly tether and grocery bills. When Meton shared his plan with his wife Thalia, she nearly dropped the pot of lentil stew she was cooking. "You're going to what?" she asked, thinking she misheard. "Give up food and drink," Meton clarified with a serene smile. "I will subsist on air alone. It's the purest form of sustenance. The gods live on ambrosia and nectar, but I suspect that's just concentrated air with a nice smell." Thalia stared as if her husband had grown a second head. "Darling, last week you nearly passed out because you skipped breakfast." "That was the old me," Meton insisted, eyes shining with missionary zeal. "This is a spiritual journey. Our mortal bodies are clogged with bread and olives and—" He shuddered theatrically. Beans. Somewhere in Croton, Pythagoras felt a pang of approval without knowing why. "But I shall be light as a feather, clean as the morning breeze." Word of Meton's pledge spread around their neighborhood faster than a kitchen fire. Soon, a small crowd gathered each day to see if he would go through with it. Never one to disappoint an audience, Meton set up a little open-air altar in the agora as if embarking on a public fast for the gods. Day one went relatively fine. He ceremoniously inhaled the morning air, proclaiming its bouquet was finer than any wine. By afternoon, his stomach growled audibly, which he hastily explained away as the music of transcendence. By evening, he was eyeing Thalia's stew pot like a hyena eyes a gazelle, but he heroically resisted. On day two, things got interesting. Meton's head felt light. He lectured anyone who passed by about the virtues of air. "See how birds thrive on it," he argued, as a pigeon pecked at crumbs near his feet. The pigeon, notably, was also eating actual crumbs. "Air is life. Our lungs feast every second. Why should our bellies be any different?" A few people nodded out of curiosity or politeness. One fruit seller muttered that he'd give Meton till day 3 before he caves and devours a whole market stall. By day 3, Meton was, to put it mildly, struggling. His face was gaunt, and he had the complexion of week-old feta. But his pride held firm. That morning, he tottered into the agora, determined to continue this public demonstration of human potential. A group of local youths had begun placing bets on when he'd give up. The smart drachmas were on any minute now. Meton sat cross-legged, inhaling deeply and exhaling the toxins of material sustenance. Thalia hovered nearby, equal parts worried and exasperated. She tried to offer him water, but he refused. "Water is just heavy air in liquid form," he wheezed, which made absolutely no sense, but at this point reasoning with him was like trying to convince Poseidon to chill out during a storm. Around midday, as the sun beat down, Meton's resolve and coherence started to melt. He began having visions. At first, he saw the gods applauding him from Olympus. Then the gods turned into giant loaves of bread, applauding him with buttery hands. Then those loaves turned into clouds which rained wine. He shook his head to dispel the hallucinations, but that only made him dizzy. Observers watched in both concern and morbid fascination. A friendly philosopher named Damon approached, kneeling next to Meton. "Friend," he whispered, "there's no shame in stopping. Even the great philosophers eat. Our minds may be divine, but our bodies are but earth." Meton frowned, summoning what little clarity he had. "Socrates said the soul is imprisoned in the body. I'm just unlocking the door." Damon sighed. "Socrates also enjoyed a good symposium with wine and cheese. Trust me, I was there." But Meton was beyond reach. By late afternoon of day 3, he was swaying where he sat, eyes unfocused. Some in the crowd grew anxious. This was no longer entertaining. It was alarming. Thalia was wringing her hands, muttering prayers to Asclepius, god of healing, to knock some sense into her husband or at least keep him alive. Finally, as the sun began to set on day 3, Meton stood up shakily, arms raised as if to hug the sky. "Behold," he croaked to the onlookers, "I feel the cosmos filling me. I think I'm floating." He indeed rose on his toes. People squinted. Was he actually levitating? For a split second, Meton himself believed he was. A triumphant smile spread across his face. "By Zeus, I have done Gravity and biology chose that moment to remind Meton he was a mere mortal. His eyes rolled back, and like a felled oak, he collapsed. Gasps rose from the crowd. Thalia rushed to him with a cry. When Meton came to, he found himself lying not on the clouds of Olympus, but on a cot in their modest home. A cool rag was on his forehead, and the smell of broth wafted nearby. Immediately he groaned, "No, take it away, I must resist." Thalia's face appeared above him, equal parts furious and relieved. "Resist, my foot! You're going to drink this, or so help me Hera, I'll ask the blacksmith to forge an air sandwich and force-feed you that." Meton's parched throat managed a weak chuckle. He realized dimly that his grand experiment had gone awry. Not only had he not proven anything, except the obvious, he had also scared his poor wife half to death. Over the next day or two, a chastened Meton recovered. He broke his fast with thin barley broth, then porridge, then solid food. The first time he bit into a ripe fig, he wept, partly out of relief, partly because it tasted so darn good. His neighbors, who had been gossiping about the spectacle, "I heard he thought Hera was a hamburger at one point," one joked, welcomed him back to normal eating with gentle ribbing and plenty of bread offerings left at his doorstep just in case. For a while, Meton avoided the agor out of embarrassment. Damon, the philosopher friend, visited to check on him. Meton confessed, "I genuinely thought I could do it. I thought maybe the gods would sustain me if I showed faith." Damon, ever the kind soul, nodded. "Seeking to elevate yourself isn't wrong, but perhaps there are better ways. Maybe try moderation next time instead of elimination?" Meton sighed. "I suppose being a breatharian was ahead of its time. He coined that term, it didn't catch on for obvious reasons. I just hate that I became the butt of jokes." "Give it time," Damon said. "Athenians have short memories. Last month's news was the man who claimed he was a child of a nymph and tried to live in a well. No one talks about him anymore, aside from calling him Frogman. A catchy nickname does wonders." He winked. Meton groaned. "Great! Now I'll be airhead for eternity." "Better than Frogman," Damon laughed. Sure enough, within weeks, the city moved on to new curiosities. Some sophist was charging admission to watch him argue with a parrot. That drew more attention. Meton returned to his routine, albeit a bit wiser. He still believed there was something divine in the air. How could he not when simply breathing had nearly sent him to the other side? But he contented himself with daily meditations at dawn, taking in the fresh breeze and whispering a thank you to Zeus for the air and Demeter for the grain. Occasionally kids would spot him and mimic exaggerated yawning inhalations or pretend to munch on nothing, giggling. Meton learned to laugh it off. In fact, he started giving little impromptu talks about what he learned. The gods gave us air and earth's bounty. To spurn one is to insult their gift. It was quite the turnaround. He inadvertently became a minor voice for balance and not taking spiritual shortcuts. Thalia, for her part, kept a close eye on his diets and his dreams. The next time Meton woke up claiming a divine vision about, say, never blinking or only walking backwards, she had a jug of cold water ready to douse him awake. But thankfully, Meton's flirtation with extreme asceticism seemed to have run its course. Thus ends the tale of the man who tried to live on air alone. A bit of a cautionary footnote in the annals of eccentric philosophers, perhaps not as famous as Diogenes in his barrel or the sage who plucked a chicken to prove a point, but remembered whenever someone in Athens bit off more than they could chew, pun intended. Because sometimes, even in the pursuit of the divine, one must remember to pack a lunch. Chapter 6. Pythagoras' Cult of the Beans. Our story now whisks us away to the Greek colony of Croton in sunny southern Italy, circa 6th century BCE. Here, a curious society flourished under the guidance of one very remarkable and very eccentric man, Pythagoras. Yes, that triangle guy you learned about in math class, though if you asked him, he'd claim triangles were the least interesting thing about him. He was a philosopher, a mystic, a cult leader avant la lettre, and above all, a man with very strong opinions about beans. Picture an elegant villa on the outskirts of Croton that served as Pythagoras' school and commune. It was part academy, part monastery, part modern yoga retreat, minus the Instagram. The initiates, men and women, lived a strict life of study, exercise, and adherence to Pythagoras' odd rules. Among these, do not eat meat, do not eat beans, do not pick up what has fallen, do not touch white roosters, do not stir the fire with an iron, and so on. The rules ranged from sensible, vegetarianism, arguably kinder on the goats, to perplexing. What did white roosters ever do to him? But the bean rule was absolute. Beans were forbidden. No chickpeas, no fava, no lentils, which, as any Greek grandmother might tell you, cuts out like half of a decent soup. Enter Philemus, a young man from Athens who had journeyed to Croton to join the Pythagoreans. He was bright and earnest, with an insatiable curiosity for the secrets of the universe, and unbeknownst to him upon arrival, a particular weakness for bean stew. On his first day, he was welcomed by senior initiates with much fanfare. They gave him simple white robes, a pair of sandals, and a list of rules. As he skimmed them, he raised an eyebrow. "No beans? At all?" he muttered. A stern-looking initiate overheard and intoned, "Beans are the vilest of all foods. To consume them is to invite moral corruption." Philemus gulped, recalling the many times he downed bowls of broad bean soup back home. Am I morally corrupt? He wondered. His mother would have been scandalized by the suggestion. In Athens, beans were considered good, cheap protein. Days at the commune began before sunrise, with Pythagoras himself waking everyone by playing a gentle melody on the lyre. Music was sacred mathematics to him. They would perform exercises, then convene for a communal breakfast, grains, nuts, fruit, but of course, no beans. That morning, Philemus noted a small altar in the dining hall with various offerings, a lyre, a compass, and strangely, a jar sealed shut. When no one was watching, he whispered to a fellow student, "What's in the jar?" The fellow widened his eyes, shook his head vigorously, and whispered back, "Shh, that's Heinzemus. We don't talk about Heinzemus." Before Philemus could ask any more, the day's lessons began. Pythagoras emerged, a tall man with a flowing beard exuding that charismatic serenity particular to those who think they've got the cosmos figured out. "Everything is number," he began in a deep voice that made even abstract math sound like a bedtime story. Philemus found himself enraptured. They talked of geometry, the harmony of the spheres. Apparently the planets and stars made music, who knew, and the transmigration of souls. Pythagoras claimed he had lived past lives, and that perhaps all of them had once been someone or something else. "So respect every being," he urged, "for your grandmother could be reincarnated in a cow, or your late uncle in a dolphin." Philemus mused that if Uncle Stavros came back as a dolphin, he hoped he'd avoid the tuna nets. It all made a kind of mystical sense, until lunch when Philemus accidentally tripped and dropped a bowl, spilling lentils across the floor. Lentils aren't beans technically, but close enough to raise eyebrows. A hush fell. Would someone scold him for picking up what has fallen if he tried to clean it? He froze, remembering that rule. Thankfully, Pythagoras was elsewhere, and a kindly older woman named Theano, Pythagoras' wife and a noted philosopher in her own right, winked at Philemus and picked up the bowl for him, whispering, "I won't tell if you won't." As weeks passed, Philemus acclimated to the peculiar life. He meditated on the sound of one hand clapping. No, sorry, wrong tradition. Rather, he meditated on the theorem that the sum of angles in a triangle equals 2 right angles, which was treated with the reverence of Scripture. He chanted hymns to Apollo and studied the properties of numbers late into the night by oil lamp. Yet, despite all this enlightenment, he couldn't shake the craving for beans. The bean ban gnawed at him. One night, curiosity, or hunger, got the better of him. He sneaked into the kitchen storage, where, in a dusty corner, he found a sack labeled with a skull and crossbones, or the ancient equivalent thereof. Inside, yes, contraband fava beans. His stomach grumbled. Surely one bean wouldn't hurt. They smelled a bit funky, fava can do that, but looked so inviting. He took a handful, and in a moment of weakness, gobbled them up. They were dried and uncooked, hardly gourmet. He nearly cracked a tooth and ended up swallowing mostly whole, not the satisfying experience he'd hoped for. Almost immediately, he felt a gurgling discomfort. Panic set in. Was it guilt, or was something horribly wrong? In the flickering lamplight, Philemus became convinced he heard whispers. He looked around. No one. Whispers again, seemingly from the sack of beans. His stomach lurched. Were the beans talking? Perhaps they were beginning to, speak in another way. Beans are the musical fruit, after all. Terrified, Philemus fled back to his cot and had a night of bizarre dreams where beans sprouted legs and chased him, while Pythagoras chanted numbers in the background. Suffice to say, he woke up in a cold sweat and vowed never to touch the forbidden legumes again. The bean taboo, it turns out, had layers of mystique behind it. Some of Pythagoras' teachings hinted at the reason. One day he lectured, "Be wary of the humble bean. It is shaped like the gates of Hades and smellier than Cerberus's breath." The students chuckled, but Pythagoras wasn't done. Some say beans contain the souls of the dead, Curious Case of Pythagoras, and The Cult That Feared Beans, by Avery DeWolf, Exploring Echoes, Medium. Others suggest that because of their resemblance to certain human organs, eating them was akin to consuming life itself, Curious Case of Pythagoras and The Cult That Feared Beans, by Avery DeWolf, Exploring Echoes, Medium. Either way, avoid them, for they tether you to the mortal coil. So it was spiritual flatulence, or worse, he was worried about. Philemus noted that Pythagoras himself grew visibly uncomfortable whenever beans were mentioned. Perhaps some childhood trauma involving a chili bowl. Not that chili existed yet, but one can imagine. Regardless, the rule was absolute. Life proceeded peacefully in the cult of the beans, or rather, the anti-beans, until one fateful day when politics intruded. Pythagoras, despite his esoteric pursuits, had amassed significant influence in Croton. Powerful men sent their sons, and some daughters, to learn from him, and his followers held important positions. This inevitably bred resentment among some of the old Crotonian elite. They sneered at these bean counters and number mystics. A conspiracy brewed to oust Pythagoras and disband his commune. One moonless night, bad things love moonless nights and stories, a group of armed men led by a jealous noble named Cylon approached the Pythagorean compound. Inside, most were asleep after a hearty dinner of barley and veggies. No meat, no beans, probably a bit gassy anyway from all those vegetables, ironically. Philemus had stayed up studying by the courtyard, under the stars, trying to calculate the distance of the sun. Pythagoras taught it was very far. He wasn't wrong. He was the first to spot shadows moving beyond the gate. Before he could raise an alarm, the intruders rushed in, torches and swords in hand. Shouts rang out. The Pythagoreans, though wise in math, were not exactly warriors. Pandemonium ensued as they scrambled. Some escaped out back doors, but many were caught. The attackers set fire to the building, evidently aiming to literally and figuratively burn down Pythagoras' influence. Philemus found himself sprinting alongside a cluster of fellow students and Theano, who had grabbed a couple of important scrolls and a small wooden idol of Apollo. "This way," someone yelled, leading them toward the fields behind the villa. Smoke billowed and flames crackled as their beloved school went up in flames. They ran through the darkness, hearts pounding, only to be confronted by a natural barrier. The fields behind the villa were sown, unfortunately, with rows and rows of bean plants. It was cropland, likely owned by a neighbor, now presenting the refugees with a dilemma. The bean plants were tall and tangled, their pods heavy with the dreaded legumes, forming a veritable wall of foliage in the night. Philemus skidded to a halt at the edge of the field. Some of his comrades hesitated too. The conditioning of years under Pythagoras was not easily shaken. "We can't go in there," whispered one man, voice quavering. "Beans." Theano, clutching the scrolls, looked at the approaching torches of the attackers and then at the field. "Better wind than fire, my friends," she said wryly, proving she had a sense of humor even in crisis. Without further hesitation, she hiked up her skirt and charged into the bean field, making a path. Emboldened, the rest followed, including Philemus. As they crashed through the beanstalks, an awful crunching and squelching of bean pods underfoot, some wept, whether from smoke, fear, or shame at defiling the taboo, who knows? Philemus felt bean vines slithering around his ankles like grasping hands of vengeful spirits. Was that whispering he heard, or just the wind through the pods? He steeled himself. This was no time for superstition. Ironic, considering everything. They emerged out the other side covered in soot and bits of bean leaves. Behind them, the Pythagorean compound was ablaze, but the attackers had halted at the bean field's edge. Whether they were also spooked by the taboo or just unwilling to pursue further in the dark was unclear, but the survivors took the respite and fled into the hills. It was a somber group that gathered at dawn in a safe hideout, a cave by the coast. Pythagoras himself had escaped by another route. Some say he eventually made it to Metapontum, where he died a few years later. Here, in the cave, about 20 of his devotees huddled, watching the sunrise over the sea and mourning their dead and their way of life. Philemus sat near Theano, stomach growling from stress and hunger. He picked a squashed bean out of a fold in his robe, one he'd unintentionally carried all the way. He held it up in the morning light. The dreaded thing that nearly cost them their lives, or saved them, depending how you looked at it. To his surprise, Theano chuckled softly at the sight of the bean. "All those years of avoiding them," she said, "and in the end, they might have saved us. The gods do have a sense of humor." Others gathered round. Some, recovering from the shock, managed weak smiles. One young acolyte joked, "Perhaps the bean field was our initiation into a higher level of secret knowledge." An older student stroked his beard. "Or a test of faith. Pythagoras always said the highest virtue was wisdom, to know when to follow rules and when to adapt." Philemus, feeling bold, popped the squashed bean into his mouth and ate it, a little grit and all. Gasps turned to laughter when he declared, "I hereby absorb the souls of our fallen comrades. May they live on in me." It was morbid humor, but humor nonetheless, and it broke the tension. Also, the bean actually didn't taste half bad raw, he thought. In the aftermath, the Pythagoreans scattered and went underground, metaphorically. The cult as it was dissolved, but the ideas lived on, transmitted quietly through those who survived. Philemus eventually made it back to Athens, carrying knowledge of math and philosophy that would influence thinkers back home. He also carried a more personal lesson. Maybe take grand pronouncements with a grain of salt and a bean or two. He never abandoned Pythagoras' teachings entirely. He could still be seen making offerings to the muses and calculating geometric patterns on temple floors for fun, but at his own dinner table, beans made a comeback to the menu. In moderate amounts, of course. Meanwhile, in Croton, people whispered of the downfall of Pythagoras. Legends grew that he had vanished in a beam of light, or that he had been taken by Apollo for his impiety. Those were likely spread by the conspirators to justify their deeds. As for the bean field, rumor had it that for years afterward, nothing would grow there. Perhaps too much trampling, or maybe the spirits of all those crushed beans enacted a petty revenge, if you believe in that sort of thing. Thus ends the tale of Pythagoras' cult of the beans, a story of knowledge and taboo, devotion and adaptability. To this day, when someone pushes a strange diet or a peculiar life rule, one might recall Pythagoras and his beans, and remember that even the wisest can be weird, and even the weirdest rules might hide a kernel or a bean of truth. Chapter 7. The Fish Oracle. Our saga now brings us to the island of Samos in the eastern Aegean, where one of the strangest prophecies in Greek history unfolded, delivered not by a priestess on a tripod, but by a humble fish, or so the tale goes. It centers on Polycrates, the 6th century BCE tyrant of Samos, a man so legendarily lucky that even his friends, and certainly his enemies, found it unnerving. Polycrates had a problem that most would consider a blessing. Everything went right for him. His navy never lost a battle, his coffers overflowed, his poetry won contests, he dabbled in the arts when not busy being a benevolent tyrant, and even the weather seemed to obey his whims for a perfect sunny day. If he tripped, he'd find a drachma on the ground. If he sneezed, someone would hand him a silk hanky before the sneeze. You get the picture, charmed life. His closest friend, King Amasis of Egypt, actually broke off their friendship out of fear. Amasis wrote to Polycrates, saying, paraphrased, "My guy, nobody stays that lucky. The gods get jealous. Disaster's coming, and I don't want front row seats when the bill arrives." He advised Polycrates to throw away his most prized possession, a sacrifice to Nemesis or fate, to show the gods he wasn't too proud of his unbroken winning streak. Essentially, take an L voluntarily, bro. Polycrates was reluctant. Who likes giving up their favorite thing? For Polycrates, that was an emerald signet ring, a stunning piece of jewelry crafted by Theodorus, a legendary artist in gold and stone. He wore it always, a symbol of his power and style, and a nifty tool for stamping royal seals. But after much fretting, and perhaps after a minor loss, still failed to materialize, he decided to take Amasis' advice. One bright morning, Polycrates boarded his royal barge and sailed out to deep water. With only a couple of trusted aides as witnesses, he prayed to the gods to accept this offering, and with a sigh, flung his precious emerald ring into the sea. He tried to look dramatic and resolved as it plopped in, but a single tear might have escaped. That ring really tied his outfits together. Back on shore, he pretended to be cheerful. His courtiers, who'd heard something of the purpose of the little excursion, praised his wisdom. "Surely now the gods will not envy you, master," one said with a forced smile, secretly thinking, glad it's him not me tossing family jewels to fish. Polycrates put on a brave face, but privately he mourned that ring like a lost pet. Days turned into a week, and Polycrates walked around perhaps a tad less smugly. He felt a void on his finger and in his psyche. But perhaps Amasis was right. Perhaps this was the token misfortune to balance the cosmic scales. Well, fate, or the gods, or whoever's running this simulation, has a twisted sense of humor. About 10 days after the ring toss, a local fisherman came striding up to the palace with an impressively large fish. This fisherman was practically bursting with excitement. He explained that earlier that morning he'd hauled in the biggest catch of his life, a hulking grouper, or maybe a sea bass. Fishtails are notoriously exaggerated. It was so splendid he thought only the tyrant himself deserved to have it as a gift. Polycrates, being a generous fellow, rewarded the man and sent the fish to the royal kitchens for a grand dinner prep. Come dinner time, Polycrates' chef presented the fish, roasted whole and aromatically spiced, on a silver platter. But as they began to carve it, lo and behold, something glinted in the belly of the fish. The chef recoiled, thinking he'd found a shard of green glass, or perhaps the fish had swallowed some cursed jewel. Servants and guests leaned in, forks paused mid-air. Polycrates himself stood, sensing something odd. He reached in to gasps of, "You!" and "Careful, it's hot," and pulled out the emerald ring. For a moment, silence. Then Polycrates laughed a bit hysterically and held it aloft. "It appears," he declared in half wonder, half dread, "that my ring has returned to me, delivered by divine providence, or by a very hungry fish." Nervous chuckles around the table. Some applauded fate's clever trick, others looked uneasy. The story spread like wildfire. The common folk loved it. "Our ruler is favored by the gods so much, even the sea gives back his gifts," they cried. Oracles, the humankind, around Greece buzzed with interpretations. Some said Poseidon himself must favor Polycrates. Others muttered that this was exactly the outcome Amasis feared, an omen that fate would not be so easily cheated. In the court of Samos, opinions were divided. One advisor suggested Polycrates immediately sacrifice something even bigger, perhaps a gold statue or a whole fleet of ships, to appease the gods' apparent refusal of his first offering. Another thought, maybe the message was that Polycrates was destined for greatness unstoppable, so he should throw caution to the wind. Polycrates, sliding the ring back on with a mix of delight and terror, decided to consult the Oracle of Delphi for clarity. Always a solid move when you're confused. Outsource the decision to a cryptic third party. Delphi's answer came back typically ambiguous, reportedly along the lines of, "He who would master fate must heed the fish's counsel." What in Hades did that mean? Was the fish's counsel the fact it coughed up the ring, i.e., "Nope, you can't avoid your fate"? Or was the fish telling him he was special? Delphi had basically said, "Figure it out yourself, buddy. We're just here for the rhymes." As Polycrates puzzled over this, far away in Egypt, Amasis got wind of the fishy development. That was the final straw for him. He'd been anxiously biting his nails, hoping his friend would manage to placate fate, but hearing that the gods, or fate, had dramatically returned the offering signaled, in his mind, doom. Amasis sent a messenger to Samos with a blunt note. "Dear Polycrates, it's not you. It's your terrifyingly good luck. We can't be friends anymore. When the inevitable disaster strikes you, I don't want to share in the fallout. Best wishes. You'll need them. Sincerely, Amasis." It was perhaps the only time in a recorded history someone ended a friendship due to excessive good fortune. Polycrates was hurt, but he couldn't exactly blame the guy. Even he felt the uneasy weight of destiny now. For a while, life went on as usual in Samos, though Polycrates couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. He kept the ring locked away this time. No way he was risking that again, prophecy or not, fool me twice, shame on me, etc. He expanded his navy, fortified the city, and tried to preempt any mortal dangers. But fate doesn't need direct confrontation to do its work. It sneaks through side doors. Enter Oroetes, the Persian satrap, governor of Sardis. Oroetes had his own reasons to dislike Polycrates, power rivalries, plus maybe he was just that guy who hates seeing someone win all the time. Seeing Polycrates seemingly invincible, Oroetes concocted a devious plan. He sent word to Polycrates that he was dissatisfied with the Persian king and wished to defect to Samos, bringing with him a trove of gold, basically promising Polycrates even more fortune. What could go wrong? All Polycrates had to do was meet him on the mainland to discuss the alliance. Polycrates' advisors were like, "This smells fishier than that prophecy fish," but Polycrates, perhaps overconfident or eager for more glory, sailed off to meet Oroetes. In a twist everyone except Polycrates saw coming, Oroetes betrayed him. Accounts vary. Some say Polycrates was ambushed, others that he was lured into captivity. The brutal ending, however, is consistent. Polycrates was killed in a rather horrific manner, crucified if one source is to be believed, or otherwise executed. Thus, the man who had known nothing but fortune met an end so grim it was spoken of for generations as the ultimate reversal of luck. Now you might be thinking, this ending isn't very funny or light. True, it's downright tragic, and the Greeks relished it as a morality tale about Olbos, prosperity, and Tyche, fortune, and the inevitable balancing act of the universe. But in the style of our narrative, let's step back and see the humor and irony laced through it. The fish, unwittingly or not, became an oracle of sorts. By delivering that ring, it essentially screamed the message that no act of man could divert fate's course. In a way, it was screaming, "Dude, you're screwed, and nothing you toss in the sea will change that." If only Polycrates had interpreted that correctly, he might have battened down the hatches or gone into nice, quiet retirement. Instead, he thought himself untouchable till the very touch of death. Some wags in Samos later joked, in dark Samian humor, that Polycrates should have tossed Oroetes into the sea instead of the ring. Then maybe a big fish would have spit the Persian back out on a plate, warning, "Don't trust this one." Hindsight, alas, is 20/20, even in myth. For our purposes, the tale of the fish oracle stands as a reminder that not all omens come from lofty oracles or flight patterns of birds. Sometimes they might come in the gut of a grouper served for dinner. One has to be wise enough to heed them and maybe know when your winning streak has peaked. On Samos today, if you stroll by the ruins of Polycrates' great works, local legends claim that on certain nights, fishermen at sea see a ghostly emerald light beneath the waves, as if a giant glowing ring still lies restless on the ocean floor. Superstitious sailors will toss a coin or a trinket overboard when they pass, a gesture of respect to the luck that was, and the luck that inevitably runs out. And they tell the story of the fortunate tyrant and the prophetic fish to any wide-eyed youngster on their first voyage as both a warning and a strangely comforting thought that even in a fish's belly, the universe might be sending us messages. It's up to us to listen. Chapter 8. The Island That Was Actually a Whale. On a crisp dawn of the classical age, a small merchant ship named the Lyre set sail from Rhodes, bound for Cyprus. Aboard were a motley crew of Greeks, Captain Eustathios, an old salt, who claimed to have wrestled a Triton once, no one believed him, first mate Doros, who had a tale for every star in the sky, and a handful of sailors and passengers seeking fortune or adventure. Among the passengers was Myron, a young poet looking for inspiration abroad, and Galen, a fisherman's daughter traveling to meet family. The journey started uneventfully, fair winds, clear skies. By midday, Doros regaled Myron and Galen with a sailor's yarn about a giant sea serpent that could swallow a ship whole. Galen rolled her eyes. "If the serpents don't get us, your stories might," she teased. Doros clutched his chest in mock offense. "Mark my words, lass, the sea is full of strange things. Why, once I saw a floating island appear overnight and vanish by morning." Myron raised an eyebrow. "Did you now?" Before Doros could launch into that account, the wind abruptly died. The sails went limp. The ship drifted to a halt in an expanse of unusually calm water, eerily still like a sheet of glass. "Dead calm," Eustathios muttered. "Poseidon's taking a nap, perhaps." Hours passed and still no breeze. Under a merciless afternoon sun, tempers flared and thirst beckoned. Just as they were considering rowing, a laborious prospect for such a distance, Galen shouted, "Land! I see land!" All heads turned. Sure enough, on the horizon to the north, a dark mass loomed. It looked like a small island, flat and forested. The prospect of setting foot on land and finding fresh water and fruit galvanized everyone. Captain Eustathios was wary. This island wasn't on any of his maps, but maps weren't perfect, and uncharted isles did exist. He allowed the crew to row toward it. As they neared, they saw a gentle slope of what appeared to be a beach, albeit a strange one. Black and rocky, not the usual golden sand. Sparse vegetation was visible further inland, perhaps small trees or scrub. They anchored in a natural cove and rowed a dinghy ashore. The surface underfoot was solid, but oddly springy in places, covered in a mix of coarse sand and what felt like dried seaweed or kelp. Nevertheless, it was land. The men cheered. Galen immediately went scouting for water. Myron and Doros gathered driftwood, there was plenty scattered about, to start a cook fire. Another passenger, a merchant named Cleon, tromped around, tapping the ground. "Hollow under some parts," he noted, as if that were fascinating. They found a couple of pools of brackish water inland, not great to drink, but in a pinch. More promising, there were seagull eggs in nests on the ground and some edible plants akin to wild leeks, enough for a passable meal. Spirits lifted as they roasted some eggs and vegetables in a pot over the fire. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in orange and purple. They'd set off again at dawn if the wind returned. Night fell. The crew of the Lyre lounged around the crackling fire, swapping stories. Doros finally got to tell his floating island tale, how a friend of a friend anchored at one that wasn't there the next day. "Probably drank too much wine," muttered Cleon, the merchant, stifling a belch from dinner. Myron, ever the poet, found the atmosphere enchanting. "An unexpected isle," he mused. "We shall be its discoverers. Perhaps I'll write an ode to Eustathios's isle." The captain snorted. "Don't name it after me. If anything, name it after the lass who spotted it. Galen's Rest has a ring." Galen smiled, stretching out near the warmth. "I could rest here indeed. The ground is so warm, like a heated bath floor." It was true. The ground radiated a gentle heat, likely from the sun's baking earlier. The sailors began nodding off one by one, full and content. Some hours past midnight, Myron awoke needing to relieve himself, too much watered wine at dinner. The embers of the fire cast a faint glow. He stumbled a bit away for privacy. The ground felt different. In places it seemed to dip and rise in soft mounds. He dismissed it as uneven terrain in the dark. Afterward, as he walked back, he placed a hand on the ground to steady himself and frowned. It wasn't cold, like earth usually got at night, nor exactly like rock. It had an almost fleshy give. He pressed a palm down. The ground yielded slightly, then sprang back. Myron's skin crawled. He suddenly recalled Doros's story, and a dozen other seafarer legends, living islands, sleeping giants, sea monsters so huge they pass for land. He hurried to Doros and shook him awake. Was it? Doros mumbled. The island, Myron whispered. I have a bad feeling. He described the spongy ground. Doros, still half asleep, muttered, Every island has some peat or bog, don't fret. Myron wasn't convinced. He went to Captain Eustathios, who was snoring loudly, and decided against rousing the old man without more evidence. Galeen was on watch at the shoreline. They agreed someone should keep an eye out for returning wind or tides. Myron joined her. All quiet? He asked. She nodded. The sea was calm and oddly warm. Almost like bathwater, she noted, dipping a toe. It was unusual. Normally nights cooled the shallows. They shared unease but couldn't place why. Then Galeen noticed something. Where's our dinghy? They had pulled it up the shore earlier. Now it was gone. In the dim starlight, they saw it a few dozen yards out floating. It must have drifted, they reasoned. We'll fetch it at first light, Myron said, hoping the captain wouldn't flay them for not tying it up securely. Moments later, a soft tremor passed under their feet. Myron's heart jumped. Galeen felt it too. Earthquake? She whispered. The tremor grew, a rolling motion that caused the ground, or whatever it was, to tilt gently. Now alarm bells rang loud in Myron's mind. Wake up! Everyone up! He shouted, rousing the camp. The ground heaved more noticeably. In the chaos of waking, someone yelled, The beach is moving! Indeed, it was. The entire island began to list to one side. Supplies and the remnants of their fire slid toward the water. In the pale light, the crew could now see the far end of the island rising. Cleon, scrambling to his feet, swore, Zeus save us! The whole island's coming alive! Captain Eustathios bellowed into action. To the ship! Now, move. Half asleep or not, the crew needed no further prodding. They dashed toward where the dinghy had been. With horror, they realized the slope to the water's edge was growing steeper. The island was tipping. A deep groan emanated from beneath, like the sound of a mountain sighing. The forest of stubby trees in the distance suddenly swayed and uprooted? No, not uprooted. Those weren't trees at all. In the dawning realization, they saw them for what they were, barnacles or growths on a massive living hide. This wasn't land. It was a living creature, perhaps a colossal whale or sea beast that had been resting on the surface. Their fires and clamoring had woken it up. Panic set in. Galeen had the presence of mind to dive into the gentle surf where the dinghy was drifting and start swimming toward it. Myron followed, as did Doros, while others flailed in confusion. Swim, you fools! Eustathios shouted, shoving a dazed Cleon toward the water before jumping in himself. As they swam, the island lifted even more. Water cascaded off its sides in torrents. What had been a quiet cove was now a whirlpool as the massive shape began to submerge. They could make out a gigantic tail end opposite the side where they'd camped, slowly rising. It dawned on Myron that they had spent the night on the back of an enormous creature, something like a whale or maybe a legendary sea turtle the size of a hill. Galeen reached the dinghy and hauled herself in, then helped Doros and Myron scramble aboard. They paddled frantically to pick up others. The suction of the sinking beast threatened to pull them back. It was like the whole sea was descending into a drain. Eustathios, stout but strong, managed to thrust Cleon up to the dinghy before grabbing on himself. They pulled him in with collective effort. 2 sailors were still in the water, struggling, but Doros hooked each with an oar, and they clambered in, sputtering. The moment all were aboard, Eustathios roared, Row! Row for your lives! 8 of them, packed in a dinghy meant for 6, they rowed with every ounce of strength. Behind them, a monstrous form breached. a broad, dark back the size of a royal courtyard, glistening in the pre-dawn light. A huge eye briefly surfaced, larger than a shield, blinking as if in groggy annoyance. Then a leviathan tail, mistaking the sky for the sea, slapped downward. The resulting splash was more like a tidal wave. The dinghy was tossed like a toy. Everyone held on as water drenched them, but miraculously, they stayed upright. When the commotion finally settled, the creature was gone beneath the waves. The island had vanished as swiftly as Doros' friend of a friend had claimed. In its place, a churning patch of sea remained. The dinghy bobbed in rough water, but gradually the sea returned to an innocent calm, as if nothing had happened. The crew, wide-eyed and panting, took stock. By some divine grace, all survived, though soaked and traumatized. The Lyre, their ship, still floated nearby. It had luckily been just far enough not to get capsized by the turbulence. They rowed weakly back to it and climbed aboard, collapsing on the deck, some kissing the solid planks. As dawn broke, a fresh breeze picked up, the wind returning as if on cue now that the night's drama was over. Eustathios, sopping and bedraggled, took the helm with shaking hands, eager to leave that cursed spot. No one objected. Doros broke the silence with a nervous laugh. "Well, I did warn you about floating islands." Gilleen, wringing out her hair, gave him a withering but amused look. "You left out the part about them being giant monsters." Myron was simultaneously terrified and elated. In his head, verses were already forming. Once a poet, always a poet. "This will make one Hades of a poem," he murmured. "Assuming anyone believes it," Cleon grunted. "I'm not sure I believe it, and I was there." "Believe it?" Captain Eustathios said, holding up a piece of charred wood, a remnant of their campfire that had somehow floated to the ship's side. It was real enough. "Poseidon's beard, lads and lasses, we spent a night on a sleeping beast. That's a first in my book." They decided, mutually and tacitly, not to attempt any further uncharted island stopovers. If they saw land from then on, they'd double-check it had the decency to stay still and not have barnacles the size of trees. When they finally reached Cyprus, they told the tale in a local tavern. At first, they got laughter and claps on the back. "Spinning tales, are ye?" But when the whole crew corroborated every detail with haunted eyes, the laughter turned to astonishment. Some Cypriots shared similar rumors they'd heard from Phoenician sailors, of a creature called Aspidocoloni, or the island turtle, known to lure sailors to camp on its back before plunging into the depths. Others compared it to stories of great whales and monsters from as far away as the Indian Ocean, passed along by spice merchants. In any case, the tale of Eustathios' island that wasn't an island spread far and wide. Back in Rhodes, Myron did write his ode, though it turned more into an epic ballad, which became popular among seafarers. In it, he poetically dubbed the creature Halios Dromos, Sea Runner, as a subtle nod to its brief appearance and disappearance. But the sailors who heard his song at port taverns would just knowingly call it the Whale Island Story. It became a cautionary tale. "Always prod the ground you land on," some joked, "or anchor your boat separately in case your island swims away." Over the centuries, some embellished the tale, adding that the creature was sent by Poseidon as a test of humility for boastful sailors, or that it guarded a treasure in its belly. Some even said that if you made a sacrifice on the creature's back before it awoke, it would reward you by carrying you swiftly to your destination. Needless to say, no one was eager to test that one. In the end, the crew of the Lyre counted themselves lucky to have survived a brush with one of the sea's great mysteries, and as they'd sit around future campfires on real islands or firmly moored on solid docks, they'd raise a cup of wine to the one island they never wanted to visit again, sharing a laugh and a shudder. The world is wide and full of wonders, they'd agree, and not all islands are what they seem. Chapter 9. the murderous musical contest. High on the slopes of Mount Tmolus in Lydia, what we'd call Western Turkey today, a most unusual concert was about to take place. The competitors, on one side, Apollo, the sun god of music, among many other portfolios, radiant in his youth and arrogance, tuning his golden lyre. On the other, Marsyas, a satyr from the Phrygian highlands, skilled with the double flute, the aulos, and perhaps a bit too bold for his own good. How did we get here? It began with Athena, oddly enough. The gray-eyed goddess had invented the aulos one day. Being a goddess, she had hobbies. But when she played it, the other gods snickered, because blowing into the instrument made her cheeks puff out in a decidedly unflattering way. Athena, vain as any Olympian, tossed the flute away in disgust, cursing it. Marsyas found this discarded flute by a river. Now, Marsyas was no ordinary satyr. He had a serious artistic streak. He picked up the instrument and, not knowing its divine origin or curse, began to play. And play he did. The music that flowed was enchanting. Notes as lively as a forest dance and as soulful as a midnight hymn. Soon Marsyas's reputation as a musician spread. He could make the flute sing like no one else. People whispered that his music was even better than Apollo's. That was a dangerous whisper. Apollo, patron of the arts, prided himself on being the best at music and archery, poetry, plague-inflicting, you name it. Normally, he welcomed mortals honing artistic skills, a tribute to him, in a sense, but claiming a rustic satyr could outplay a god, that couldn't stand. Fueled by perhaps both pride and a mischievous challenge, Apollo appeared in Phrygia and essentially said, "All right, goat boy, let's see what you've got." Marsyas, perhaps egged on by local admirers or his own competitive nature, agreed to a contest. The terms were severe. Likely Apollo's doing, the winner could do anything they wanted to the loser. If Marsyas won, hey, maybe he'd get some cool favor. But if he lost, well, the god would decide his fate. In hindsight, a terrifying prospect. But satyrs are known to dive headlong into revelry and dare. Perhaps Marsyas thought the risk was worth the glory. And so, atop Mount Tmolus they gathered. Apollo even allowed a panel of judges, the Muses, or perhaps the mountain's spirit, Tmolus himself, accounts differ. Word had gotten around, so nymphs, shepherds, and even King Midas of neighboring Phrygia turned up to watch the showdown. Midas loved a good tune and never missed a gig, even though, as we'll see, his taste was questionable. Marsyas went first. He lifted the wooden flute to his lips and poured his heart into a melody. It was wild and free. The kind of tune that makes you want to dance barefoot through a meadow after one too many cups of wine. Birds fluttered closer to listen, rabbits and deer poked their heads from the brush, even the leaves on the trees seemed to sway in rhythm. By the end, some of the muses were smiling and clapping along. Midas was tapping his foot enthusiastically. Marsyas finished with a flourish, a bit of sweat on his brow, to hearty applause. Apollo gave a polite golf clap, then stood. "Not bad," he said smirking, "for a satyr." He then plucked his lyre, a simple scale to warm up. The notes were crystal clear, ethereal. When he truly began his performance, it was as if time stood still. Apollo's music was structured yet soulful, a celestial order in every arpeggio. If Marsyas's tune was a rustic dance, Apollo's was a stately procession of the gods. The spectators were in awe. Some wept at the sheer beauty. The competition could have easily ended there. It was clear Apollo's divine artistry was unmatched, and indeed, the judges leaned toward declaring Apollo the victor. But Apollo wasn't done flexing. "How about a second round, friend?" he said to Marsyas. Perhaps Marsyas should have bowed out then, conceding gracefully. But pride is a fickle master. Marsyas agreed to continue. Apollo proposed they play and sing at the same time, a strange request since you can't sing and play a wind instrument simultaneously, unless you're particularly good at multitasking, which even for a satyr is tricky. Marsyas protested, but Apollo insisted any true musician should be able to accompany their own voice. The judges, Apollo's sisters, the Muses, remember, shrugged. The god was pushing boundaries, but who were they to refuse an Olympian? Marsyas tried. He really did. He puffed his cheeks, ironically like Athena had, and attempted to hum while playing. It was a disaster. The flute squawked, his humming wobbled. The audience cringed in sympathy. Midas winced and made a mental note. Flutes and vocals, not a great mix. Marsyas stopped, looking defeated and a bit humiliated. Then Apollo stepped up for his turn in the second round. With a smug wink, he began to play the lyre and sing, and oh, what a song! His voice was like sunlight made audible, harmonizing perfectly with the lyre's strings. The hymn praised the gods, and not so subtly himself, and echoed through the valleys. It was overkill at this point. The contest was decisively won. The judges unsurprisingly crowned Apollo the victor. Marsyas bowed his head, accepting the outcome, though some say he muttered that Apollo had won on a technicality. Perhaps in a fairer world, Marsyas would have been spared with a stern scolding or a token punishment. But Apollo, flushed with triumph, remembered the stakes. He could do anything to the loser. And in that moment, perhaps the slight of someone daring to challenge a god or the arrogance of needing to prove a point overtook him. He decided to make Marsyas an example. With a snap of his fingers, Apollo summoned his attendants, possibly some scary-looking Scythian mercenaries, or maybe an automaton or two from Hephaestus's workshop, God's outsource. After all, they seized Marsyas. The satyr cried out, now truly afraid. Apollo produced a knife, or perhaps he just gestured and a blade appeared. What came next is not for the faint of heart. Apollo ordered Marsyas to be flayed alive, his skin removed from his body. As the gruesome deed was done, the joyous woods fell silent. The nymphs who had cheered for Marsyas screamed and fled. Even some of the Muses turned away in horror. King Midas was aghast. "Is music not enough, my lord?" "This is too far," he exclaimed. Apollo, still high on his own righteousness, snapped, "Too far? Perhaps your taste is with the satyr then. Maybe you think he should have won?" Midas gulped, realizing he should have kept his royal mouth shut. In truth, Midas did prefer Marsyas's earthy tune over Apollo's perfection, but you don't tell a god that. Apollo, reading the discomfort in Midas's face, decided to give the king a parting gift. He reached out, and with a touch transformed Midas's ears into those of a donkey. "That suits your taste better," Apollo said coldly. And thus Midas got his legendary ass's ears for his perceived insult. Meanwhile, poor Marsyas's body was lifeless. His blood flowed into a river that would thereafter bear his name. The assembled crowd was shell-shocked. Apollo, as if waking from a trance of wrath, looked at what he had wrought. Perhaps a pang of guilt hit him. The myths aren't explicit about Apollo's remorse, but how could it not, seeing the brutality of Marsyas's fate? The god left swiftly, maybe to go purify himself. Killing, especially such a savage killing, required ritual cleansing even for gods. The aftermath was a mix of sorrow and lessons learned. The river Marsyas ran red for a while, the land mourning its satyr friend. The Muses, in honor of Marsyas's skill, hung his flute in a temple, where it quietly vanished. Some say Olympus, some say it simply returned to Athena's hands somehow. King Midas, humiliated with animal ears, later had to hide them under a turban, and only his barber knew the secret. Until the barber couldn't hold it in and whispered into the ground, "Midas has donkey ears." But that's another story. Mortals took a clear moral Challenging the gods was a risky business. Not that Marsyas was the first or last to learn that the hard way, but the story spread as both a warning and a tragedy. In time, some softened the tale, saying Apollo later repented and shed tears that turned into the river, or that Marsyas's spirit became a wind that still plays music in the reeds by the riverbank. The more philosophically inclined saw it as a metaphor, the rational, ordered art of civilization, Apollo, triumphing over the wild, untamed art of nature, Marsyas. But many, especially those with an artistic soul, always felt Marsyas got a raw deal, quite literally. In the ages that followed, painters and poets depicted the contest, often highlighting Apollo's aloof cruelty and Marsyas's agony as a commentary on hubris and divine justice. Even Ovid in his Metamorphoses recounts how Marsyas cried, "Why do you strip me from myself?" during that merciless flaying, a line that can tug at anyone's heartstrings. Apollo, for all his virtues, carries this stain on his lore, a reminder that even the radiant god of music had a dark side. Yet, in a strangely fitting way, Marsyas did achieve a sort of immortality through his story. Musicians and free spirits would toast to Marsyas as a martyred hero of artistic freedom, albeit quietly, so Apollo wouldn't hear. And Apollo, he remained the unrivaled virtuoso of Olympus, but perhaps a tad more feared than loved in this aspect. So ends the murderous musical contest, a tale that strikes a chord of both inspiration and caution. In modern terms, it's as if a garage band dared a superstar to a rock-off and actually made the legend sweat for a moment, only for the legend to smash the guitar over the challenger's head. Extreme? Yes, but that's Greek mythology for you, where the stakes are god-high and the outcomes operatic.